Welcome back, everybody. So I think I'm about to do something pretty weird, and that is watch the 1915 movie, The Birth of a Nation. This is something I didn't really see myself doing in general for a couple of reasons. One, because the movie is just horrifyingly offensive, and two, because it's a 3-hour-long silent movie. So neither of those two things appeal to me and my core values and my sense of what's entertaining. But something just made me want to watch it, I guess. I have a little bit of trepidation about this. I'm not sure how it's going to go, how it'll feel watching this movie. I don't know if this is something I can even really make content out of. So I'm recording this not knowing if anybody's going to watch this introduction. But I wanted to give my thoughts going into this. And also I wanted to watch the whole thing before I started taking notes or recording anything like that. So this is going to be different than my usual approach. I usually, when I start watching something, I want to start pausing and taking notes and stuff like that. Because every time I get a thought in my head, I want to make sure I capture it. But this one, I want to be determined just to watch the whole thing start to finish before I actually start processing it or anything, just to see what it's like. Now, just as I have some feelings about doing this, I can see how other people might have them as well. The reasons for doing this, even though it is a horrible and offensive film, from what I understand, are probably pretty obvious on the surface. Number one, you want to understand it as a text, what its racist message means for us as a country and maybe what it has communicated to us, what its relevance is on those grounds. Also, from what I understand, it is a somewhat groundbreaking film, or is understood to be one. So there are reasons to watch this. That said, I can understand people having feelings one way or the other about, somebody watching this and publicly discussing it. Me as a Caucasian fellow, taking that upon myself. So I don't know. If this isn't something you want to watch, both because you feel like it's inappropriate for me to publicize and make a thing of, and also just if it's a painful subject matter, I totally get you wanting to turn away and not watch this one. I'm not 100% sure myself, like I said. So, we'll just kind of see how this goes. You'll find out if I actually end up making a video about this. If you're watching this, it means I did. And so actually one reason I wanted to record my thoughts before I started watching this is that going in, I really know relatively little about this, which seems strange. It's one of these movies that has just been this ever-lingering presence. I've heard about it in film classes and stuff like that. I know it's there. I know it's kind of the big thing. It's a cultural phenomenon, but I don't really have firsthand knowledge of it. And I think that's partly, I have this curiosity about things that exist in my head as a general idea, see what they're actually like to experience. So maybe there is a little bit of morbid curiosity to this. But what I know going into this is, number one, that it's understood to be a very racist movie. It glorifies the Klan. From what I understand, it doesn't have a super nice depiction of Black people. And it represents Black men specifically as a threat to white women, no surprise. Also that it has a reputation as a big, grand, sweeping film, as a big technical achievement, which I think might be overblown. I'm not 100% sure about that. And that it's a pretty sweeping movie, I guess, in terms of just overall scale. It's over 3 hours long. And so I'm a little curious what kind of story this is going to be. I also think that it is about the rise of the rise of the Klan after the fall of the Confederacy. But really, I don't know much about the context. So there's probably some larger historical events going on here beyond whatever tale they tell about, whatever characters are in the story. So beyond that, I don't know much about the structure of this film. How racist it really is, what that racism looks like compared to what we see as, acceptable and unacceptable today. I'm not really sure. So I guess I'm going to give this a shot and see how it goes. And if you're watching this, I guess after the intro, you'll see me talk about Birth of a Nation. All right. So I just finished watching that movie and yeah, it was a lot to take in. I feel weird having watched it and not in a good way. So here's what's happening. Just to let you know where this is going. I have decided that I am going to make a video about this movie. Having watched it, I think it's something I can work with. But what I'm doing right now is I'm just giving my quick thoughts about how I feel and what I thought immediately after watching. Once this is done, I'll actually go back and watch the movie in more depth, stop and take notes, and give you a in-depth video essay using examples and stuff. I'll try not to get into examples and specifics here. This is just generally how this movie makes somebody like me feel, I guess, if that's something you want to watch. If not, I'll have chapters here and you can skip ahead to the video essay part. So yeah, it felt gross watching this. And one thing I just want to be careful about and acknowledge is it would be really easy for me to sit here and act sanctimonious about how much this movie affected me and how much I just hate it because, I hate racism and it just really dug at me inside. That's kind of true, but I don't want to put on a show of that. I just want to get out there the reality of what this was like. And one big elephant in the room is I know that I am a white dude talking about this movie, and that can be a little bit weird. I don't want to be sitting here preaching about racism as somebody in my position. In a lot of ways, the Black community should own or at least be involved in these kinds of things and not have white people talking to white people about the effects of racism. But there are a few reasons that I think this is just important to talk about, and I'll get into those more as the actual video essay goes on. But I guess the thing here is I'm acknowledging that whatever effect this had on me can be seen in kind of a weekend warrior basis. It is ugly, but I also have to acknowledge I don't carry that ugliness with me everywhere I go. I don't walk around being seen because of my skin color and feel that just with me all the time. And so dipping into this and experiencing it is different for me than it would be for a lot of other people. But it is still kind of affecting. And there are a few different parts of this. One, I think, is just the volume of it. We all see racist things from time to time, and we all might be shocked by them, hopefully. But you kind of know how to compartmentalize them, I guess. And this was harder to do for a couple reasons. First, just sitting in it for 3 hours. I didn't watch this all in one sitting, but I just watched without taking notes and just absorbed it. Sitting there with it for that long and stewing in it, it just starts to feel rotten after a while, and I don't like it. And part of it is, I really hate to say this, and please hear me correctly when I say this, because I'm not saying I like this movie at all, but you do feel emotionally invested in uncomfortable things for uncomfortable reasons. Those reasons being what the filmmaker wants you to be invested in. There are times where, for racist reasons, he will set up white people as being in peril or being in danger, and you can't help but hope they get out of it. And that's an uncomfortable thing, knowing that he is yanking your chain, setting up this situation where a protagonist is in some kind of danger, and that person is going to be white, and the Black person is going to do something bad to them. And you want the white person to get away, and you think the Black person is horrible. In that specific situation, that is the case. But you know that it's been set up and contrived by a racist to appeal to racists. And so I can know that, and I can understand in the back of my mind what's actually happening here, but your emotions still get invested in that. And that's just an incredibly ugly feeling, and I don't like it. Another part of it is that makes it hard to compartmentalize is the real ick of this movie isn't just in the racism itself. It's that the racism doesn't feel as foreign as I would like. It would be easy to see this as blunt, old-timey racism. And that's kind of what I expected. I didn't know exactly what to expect beyond that this was an old movie and that it was racist. And so I'd kind of pictured something that was way different in its language and the way it expressed itself, and just kind of this crusty old thing from the past. And maybe there's a certain amount of bigotry in that I have toward people who lived in the past, thinking that they think way differently than we do and express themselves in simpler ways than we do, and that this would just feel foreign to me. But this felt way too familiar. This felt like modern racism. And this is something I'll definitely explore as we go on. That's going to be one of the core ideas that I see woven through this movie, is that it's not that foreign to what we are today. The racism was more kind of maybe sophisticated than I had expected. This movie, I don't think, presents itself as disliking Black people. In fact, it has Black friends. Really weird. We'll get into that more as it goes on. The real antagonists, as you might not be too surprised, are like Northern abolitionists and stuff like that. But it covers for itself and excuses itself and presents its racism in a way that feels a lot like the way people do today. And the core racist dog whistles and everything are the same. And that was, I think, what I found most disturbing. You can't set this aside and just see it as something in the past and think, wow, we've come somewhere from here. We are different people now. This is very much the same. And yeah, it says a lot about our society and us as people and everything. Again, I'm starting to expound in ways that I don't want to right now. I'll get into that more in the video essay proper once I've broken things down. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts. That's how I feel after watching Birth of a Nation. I'm going to stop now, and it's going to be a while, but I'll get back after having watched this and broken things down with notes and stuff and give you more of a detailed video essay about it. I'll see you then. So anyway, hi, this is me from the future, at least relative to the first two clips you watched. And I just spent some time breaking the movie down in a little more detail. So let's dive right into it, huh? The movie is freely available in the public domain, so you can easily just go watch it on YouTube if that's the kind of thing you're into. And the first thing I noticed is there are just a lot of full versions of the movie running around at different lengths. A common one was just over 3 hours, but some ran just over 2 hours or even shorter. Now, it turns out that this movie runs at different lengths for organic reasons that actually go back to the beginning. It's not just people on YouTube trying to speed it up because it's a boring old movie and they want to help you get through it a little bit faster. Different projectors would run the movie at different speeds. So if you were to go to a theater way back in the day to watch The Birth of a Nation, you might watch it in 2.5 hours. You might watch it in about 3 hours. It just depends on the projector. There were also issues of censorship, so this movie might be cut differently depending on where you were watching it. So I guess the thing is, the movie-going experience was different back then for a lot of different reasons. But one of them was that a movie was not this completely gelled, solidified work of art that was completely the same every time you watched it the way it is today. They didn't have the same expectations of movies back then that we do now. Now, here's a question, and it might seem a little silly. Some of you already probably know where I'm going with this. But if the movie played at different speeds, wouldn't that mess up the musical score? Because these do play with accompanying music. But the music was not actually recorded onto film. And this probably goes without saying once you take a minute to think about it, but I'm not sure everybody does to the extent of actually knowing what was going on in a theater. Movies were played completely silent. The reason there was no sound, there was no people talking or anything like that, was not just because they didn't have mics on set. It's because the film could not actually run with sound recordings. And so what they would do is they would actually have somebody with a piano, maybe if you were in a small town theater, or maybe if you were in a big grand movie hall, they'd have a whole orchestra, but they would just have people playing music during the theater. At first, they would just hire musicians just to come in and play whatever they wanted to, more or less, or whatever they were instructed to by their specific theater. And it was just supposed to be music that fit the mood of the movie. It wasn't a soundtrack the way we think of it now. But I guess Birth of the Nation, why do you keep wanting to call it Birth of the Nation? Birth of a Nation was the first movie, as far as I know, or one of the first movies that actually had a designated soundtrack. So they wrote sheet music that was to go out with the movie to the theaters, and whoever was playing the music was supposed to play specific music with specific scenes. This would vary some naturally depending on how fast the movie was playing at that theater and what kind of cut they're playing. So there's probably still some room for improvisation. But watching Birth of a Nation was a little bit different because it did have some kind of uniform musical score. And this did a lot, and this is going to be relevant as we go on. This did a lot to make the movie kind of effective trash propaganda, because having a specific musical score can do a lot to set the mood of a movie and get people caught up in it, right? So I guess good job, Birth of a Nation. You aren't getting a handshake from me, but technically they did do something well. That's a lot here that, isn't really specific to Birth of a Nation, but some stuff like this really helps set the context of what's happening in this movie and maybe understand what the experience was like watching it. It also can help you understand moving forward how people were affected by this and, maybe how it stirred up the worst racist inclinations in people by being kind of a pioneering film. It wasn't totally pioneering. It has a very overblown reputation. I think I stated that way back earlier before I'd watched the movie, but it did do a lot of things well, at least on a popular scale for American audiences. So anyway, I picked a longer version of the movie. I said there were different versions. I picked, I think, the longest one I could find just to make sure I was getting the full thing. I wasn't watching an edited down version or anything. So yeah, I sat through all that. Yuck. I'll try not to virtue signal too much not liking this movie. That's an easy thing to do. But also, it just really is appalling, so it happens naturally. Anyway, let's start watching this. So actually, it's going to take a minute to go through the title sequence because it is very long and drawn out, and it's also very different from what we usually watch in movies. So parking on this a minute will help. Also, because this is a silent movie, a lot of the propaganda value is in the title cards, both at the beginning and throughout the movie. Now, the first card makes it abundantly clear that this film was made by D.W. Griffith. So just come right out and own your racism, you filthy bastard. Like, his name is on here so many times, it feels like Neil Breen's end credits. And this just sits on screen for like 14 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it sure feels like a lot when you're sitting there watching it. Next is a statement that all pictures made by him have Griffith and DG on the borders of its captions, and that there is no exception, which maybe sounds funny and a little weirdly, I don't know, possessive or egotistical or something. But if I'm to be fair to D.W. Griffith, and that's not an instinct that comes naturally to me, this might just be a product of how new the film industry was at the time. There might not have been really set in stone copyright laws or ways yet of enforcing them. So with branding being really important, this might have just been him trying to grasp control over his own work and, avoid imitators and stuff like that. Who knows? Now, this next slide gets interesting and really starts to hint at the sensitive nature of what we're about to watch. It's called A Plea for the Art of Motion Picture and says, "We don't fear censorship because this movie doesn't mean to be obscene. It just shows us the dark side of wrong so we can see the bright side of light." And he kind of compares what he's doing with this movie to Shakespeare in the Bible. So maybe pump the brakes there, clan trash. But I find it kind of interesting that even back in 1915, people already had this reflex to complain about cancel culture when they were setting out to do something massively racist. I don't know if this is just a universal thing, it's, something people automatically do when they know they're going to be offensive, or whether maybe D.W. Griffith kind of pioneered the art of being sanctimonious about being a shithead. But this is one of those little things, and we're going to see a lot of them throughout the movie, that just shows me how similar racism back then was to racism today. And I know that the language and feel of it is a little different just because times change and the way we communicate is different. But the core racist attitudes really aren't that different. And this is one of the most uncomfortable things about this movie. It's not this kind of weird, archaic relic that you can compartmentalize, set aside, and say, wow, weren't people different back then? It's less that and more of a through line that started back then or maybe before then and has continued through today. And so it says something deep about the core of our national character, even until now, that I find just kind of disturbing to sit with. But I think it's important that we spend some time sitting with it. And that's why I think it is important to talk about this movie. Even if I'm a white person talking to maybe largely other white people about it, I think this is something we need to be aware of and talk about. Even though I think Black people should largely own a lot of the conversation about race and racism and stuff. It's important that we take a good hard look at this and see what it means about us, even if we think we're some of the good people, what is ingrained in our culture, in our nation, and maybe to some extent in ourselves. Anyway, roughly a minute in, we get the actual title of the movie, then some opening credits. The only interesting things here, at least that I noticed, are that this movie stars Lillian Gish, who was a really big star of the silent film era. So this movie was headlined by more of an A-list actress than her time's equivalent of, say, Gina Carano. You might also notice that pretty high up in the credits are characters listed as mulattoes, which is kind of a slur for a person of mixed black and white race. So gives you an idea of where this movie is headed. Yeah. Then we get a notice expressing hope that this movie's depiction of war might contribute to anti-war sentiment. So more of Griffin preemptively patting himself on the back for doing something more high-minded than, being a trashy racist. And speaking of being a trashy racist, the next slide blames Black people for causing all this trouble by being forcibly brought over here. So, fuck you and the horse you rode in on. Though you and your horse are already fucking each other if I know your type, clan trash. Interesting, though, that the movie seems to be admitting that the Civil War was about slavery. A certain amount of honesty in that, I guess. Now, at this point, we're about 3 minutes in, and that whole time is spent just watching 6 title cards, which might not sound like a lot, but it feels like a lot when you're watching it. And this might not be a commentary as much on this movie being slow-paced as it is on, us as audiences expecting things to come really fast. Like back in the day, or maybe at most times in history, getting to go sit in a chair in a room and watch some slides pass by while you're listening to music might have just been a nice, relaxing, enjoyable thing to do. So I don't know. If we ever face some kind of final judgment, I guess I'll be okay pleading guilty to my short attention span and letting D.W. Griffith plead guilty to this movie. This then takes us to the first actual footage of the movie, which is those troublemaking Africans troublemakingly being bound and enslaved against their will. Jesus, maybe the racism in this movie isn't as slow a burn as I remember from the first time. I guess there's also a Puritan-looking guy praying over them or something. I couldn't care less, really. Then we establish that the abolitionists are demanding that the slaves be freed. You can imagine these are going to be the bad guys, or at least behind the movie's antagonistic forces. But the scene feels just kind of understated. It's just a bunch of well-to-do-ish looking white people at a gathering that would be totally generic if not for the fact that there were a couple black men on stage. On a side note, they themselves kind of sit there looking curiously stone-faced. I'm not sure whether this is how they were meant to be depicted in the scene or whether he just grabbed a couple black men and they just sat uncomfortably while the camera rolled. And this gets me curious about what it was like for these guys. Did they know what kind of movie they were going to be in? How did they feel about being filmed? Where did Griffith find them? And how did he treat them and pay them? How many of them became aware of their role in this film and what the overall movie was like? And how did they feel about that afterward? There weren't a lot of actual black people in this movie, at least in the main roles. A ton of blackface acting, surprise, surprise. But I feel like there's a sordid and probably sad story behind the people who ended up on screen. And it's just kind of depressing to watch. It feels like an actual look back in time at the population most affected by trash like this movie. Anyway, a guy also leads a young black boy down the aisle, and there's a moment where they cut to a pose of them standing together. It's a curious looking shot that obviously isn't continuous with a scene before or after, and then they collect money. The only thing I can think this scene is ultimately going for is the suggestion that this is all an unscrupulous fundraising thing where black people are paraded out to pull at people's heartstrings and then, they pass the collection plate. That, and I guess just the overall vibe of a bunch of, fancy self-righteous Yankees putting on airs. The scene feels like it's supposed to be setting a lot of the foundation for the movie, but it just doesn't show us much, which I find kind of curious. But maybe a lot of the insinuation is lost in cultural translation, and that might be the case with a lot of this movie. The next scene is where we get our first clear narrative direction and our first characters who are going to actually be major players in this movie. And that's with the introduction of Austin Stoneman, who is one of the movie's main bad guys. He's introduced as a parliamentary leader. Curious use of language, as we don't have a parliamentary system in the US, but whatever, maybe a relic of language. And it says that he's rising to power in the House of Representatives, which seems meant to cast him as an opportunist. Nothing much really happens in this scene. His daughter Elsie just fixes him up, and then the camera cuts to them sitting there as if they just spontaneously posed for a photograph. Which maybe that was the idea. Maybe they were posing for a photograph and that's what they were showing us, but it doesn't say that. And the whole thing just feels kind of weird and awkward and artificial. And I can't tell whether it was the movie just framing them there or whether they were the two characters getting their picture taken. But that's it. I think this scene is mostly here just to show us who these characters are. But there is one other thing. I think one point of the scene is to conspicuously show Elsie pulling Austin's toupee back and fixing it. So I think this is kind of just to mock him as a buffoon who puts on a facade of dignity for the public. So I'd go so far as to say that this hairpiece is kind of a central metaphor for him as this puffed up character who's really nothing on the inside. And if that sounds like a stretch, and it probably doesn't, but if it does, the movie also goes out of its way to later show him wearing a platform shoe. So, I think it's really riffing hard on this guy. Doesn't like him. Also, his daughter is played by the famous Lillian Gish and will be another central character. Then we get a scene showing Elsie with her brothers. It starts with the brothers sitting together looking at a letter. And it's a little confusing because I would assume they just received it, but it's from them to a Ben saying that they're about to go visit him and his family. So not sure why they're just sitting there looking at their own letter that they are about to send to someone else. But this is for the purpose of exposition. It's just to show us that they are about to go visit a family in the South. You can imagine this being a pre-Civil War thing, that this will be consequential. Elsie comes out with a cat and there's a bunch of chasing about and they go inside. Confusing and far less consequential. And this is where, as with a lot of scenes, especially the funny ones, there's probably a lot of cinematic and cultural shorthand that's lost to us today just because they express themselves different. This is all just part of watching old movies, I guess. But in these two scenes, Austin and Elsie and then her with her brothers, the point is just introducing us to the Northern family in this equation. And now we're about to get introduced to the Southern family, the one they're about to go meet, the Camerons. The title card says that they live in a quaintly way that is to be no more. And you can probably tell what this is and what it's meant to get at if you've ever met a Lost Cause shithead. It's representing the antebellum South as this sweet, innocent, nostalgic thing that's, never harmed nary a soul. And isn't it a tragedy that it's been lost to the march of time and of Union soldiers, for no good reason whatsoever? Because notice that this title card makes just absolutely no mention of the fact that this quaintly way of life is built on holding people captive and forcing them to work for free. I mean, that feels relevant, right? Isn't that the kind of thing that maybe we should plug into the equation if we're making any honest attempt to understand what happened here? Well, this movie sure doesn't. And it's clear that it's leaning into a pretty by-the-numbers way of evoking sympathy for the South. It's so obvious that I find it kind of uninteresting, and, it probably does to you too, if, at least again, you've ever been exposed to the garbage discourse that comes from racists. Oops, I meant Confederate apologists. Yeah, actually, I also meant racists too. Aren't synonyms fun? But what I find more interesting and sad is that this movie's view of the South is basically beat by beat the same as modern conservatives' view of and reaction to all of American history. Both take a nostalgic view of some favorite era of history. The Birth of a Nation is the antebellum South, and modern conservatism's is the 1950s, or at least the general vibe associated with the 1950s. Each has constructed a fictional version of its respected era as this simpler, purer, more traditional time when society had pretty much reached its peak, and of course each avoids looking too hard at the experience of black people during that time. Or maybe even, appreciates that they knew their place back then. But alas, that time has been lost, we've degenerated from that level of greatness, and each responds to this problem in roughly the same way. 1, blaming some kind of corrupting, agitating force for making things worse, and 2, devoting themselves and I guess sometimes their slogans to making their country great again. Now, the way the modern right has represented these agitators is as familiar as the air we breathe. From hippies and unruly blacks in the 60s to Antifa and BLM and whatever today, the lunatic left has really just been trying to unravel the fabric of what makes America great. You know what it sounds like. And keeping it in mind will help you contextualize what you're seeing as we continue through The Birth of a Nation. Because the rest of the movie from here on out is basically just the exact same demonization of agitators using the same fear-mongering tactics. Which makes you wonder, is modern MAGA rhetoric and basically the entire conservative framework for reacting to social change, especially around and adjacent to racism, just an organic continuation of the Klan bemoaning the fall of the Confederacy and the freeing of black slaves? Or are they at least woven together in some way? I guess I'll leave that to you to consider as we move forward, but the answer is probably some level of yes. So I guess the more things change, the more things stay stupid, right? Now, yeah, that did end up being a long diversion based on one title card, but those title cards are there for a reason, and they set a lot of the rhetorical context that helps us understand what this otherwise wordless movie means. They really show us what this movie is, and yes, how similar it is to modern conservatism/racism. Aren't synonyms fun? Anyway, now on to this Southern family the Stonemans are about to visit. We're first introduced to their oldest son named Ben Cameron. They call him Benny in the title card, and he's also sometimes referred to as the Little Colonel. If you've sniffed out the fact that these cutely diminutive names are a ham-fisted attempt at making him come off as sympathetic, then congratulations, you're smart. And the reason for this is about the most directly on-the-nose one you might imagine. You might already be thinking it now. But spoiler alert, if not, and you want to be surprised later, go ahead and skip ahead a few seconds. He's the founder of the fucking Klan. Anyway, our introduction to him is a little strange. We see him standing next to a picket fence looking all fancy and top-hatted before he goes and greets a woman on a fancy carriage. Which, fine, I guess. He's meant to be set up as this dashing, well-mannered young man. But this is interrupted by a cut to a bunch of black people loaded into the back of a much less fancy cart, and some kids fall or jump out, and then an old black guy picks them up and spanks them and puts them back. Not sure why this is in the movie, except maybe to show how poor and low-class the blacks are, and not sure why it's kind of weirdly inserted here in our introduction to Ben Cameron, except, I guess, to show how low class they are by comparison to him. Or maybe it's just comedy that we don't get anymore, but kind of weird. Then we get an introduction to Margaret Cameron, a daughter of the South trained in manners of the old school. Unlike those black people we just saw who I guess were so lacking in manners that they had to pile up into an old cart like poor people because they were so poor. And slaves. Gee, stop being forced to work in the fields for 5 minutes and learn some manners, people. These little asides are meant to paint an idealized and hierarchical picture of the antebellum slaveholding South, which is one of the movie's main rhetorical goals. So expect to see this thread continue. Margaret just kind of walks around and apparently does some housekeeping. Then we get our next introduction to the mother and the little pet sister. Now, pet sister is probably a weird sounding word to us that I think is just a product of its time. I think roughly speaking, it refers to a younger sibling that everybody kind of dotes over. And by the way, I know I'm stepping on a lot so far. We're only about 8 minutes into this movie. But that's because we're at the stage where we're still introducing a lot of characters and concepts. So hopefully this will go faster as we move on. Anyway, there is an important core point here, which is the reason she's referred to as the pet sister and the reason they have her in this movie at all, why they have this much younger, cute little sibling, is to make her seem sympathetic for an ugly reason we will see play out later. Then the kindly master of Cameron Hall. So basically the dad of the Southern Cameron family, except this movie can't help but, try to sound fancy all the time and also sound super on the nose about who we're supposed to sympathize with, in case we've been missing it to this point. He just sits there looking at something with Ben, and we pan down to see puppies at his feet for some reason. They're super cute, and I'm glad they never had to know what kind of movie they were in. Ben also plays around with his pet sister, again playing to our sympathies foreshadowing. And also, we have a couple offensive things here, because of course. We have a very conspicuously black-faced household servant who seems very happy for the family. That will be a whole thing. And Dad randomly sets a kitten on the puppies, and we flash to a simple title card reading, Hostilities. I think they're supposed to be fighting, but they're not really. Seems like it's supposed to be a metaphor for tensions in the U.S. Black people and white people mix about as well as cats and dogs, which, number one, is not true. And number two, if it were, whose fault is that? Movie doesn't seem to dwell on that at all. But who would ever see victim blaming coming from Birth of a Nation? Anyway, big sister Margaret comes out and gives Ben the letter from the Stonemans saying they're about to come visit. Then next scene, the Stonemans show up. Happy greetings all around, though I'm still not sure how the Stonemans and Camerons know each other. Never established in the movie as far as I can tell. Maybe it's just fancy proper white people showing off all their good manners. Oh, and Phil Stoneman and Margaret Cameron just take an instant shining to each other. So yeah, gonna be some romantic crisscrossing between these families. And next we have the Chums, the younger sons, North and South, which drips heavy with themes about friends and brothers who will be pitted against each other by the Civil War. And just to add that little extra layer of symbolism on there, they playfully fight with each other. It's called foreshadowing, people. And as you watch this, you can tell these two just really think they're spinning comedy gold. And who knows, maybe they were by 1915 standards, but I don't care, this movie's trash. Now, so far, we've seen the Cameron family at home, so now it's on to the cotton fields. So this movie's about to take another turn for the racist. Now, first, you'll notice that the movie has a very blue tint to it here. Your eyes aren't playing tricks on you, and this isn't a problem with the quality of the film. The film is deliberately tinted for different scenes, either to distinguish day from night or sometimes for dramatic purposes. There's also, and you may have noticed it, kind of this spotlight effect, which I think is an old-timey way to focus your attention to specific things on the screen. I don't care to dive too much into how these tools are used. Number one, it's not really my point. And number two, I'm not an expert on film history or, cinematography. But it is worth being aware of them because you will keep seeing them as we move forward. The spotlighting one, I will say, does seem to be, like I said, number one, for just drawing our attention to something. But also it seems like D.W. Griffith, for all his many, many faults, was clever at using his resources. And so I think sometimes when there was supposed to be a scene that was big in scope, like a giant battle scene or maybe a giant city or on fire or something like that, he'd sometimes use that to just show us part of it when he couldn't film the whole thing and our minds would fill in the rest. But anyway, again, not going to get too much into that. But getting to the actual point, this part of the scene has the Camerons taking the Stonemans out to see their fields and the slaves who are working in them. So basically slave tourism, I guess. Come see the exotic black people we have picking cotton in our fields. I hate even saying stuff like this, but it is what's going on. We also hit another important plot beat here where Ben Cameron finds a picture of Elsie Stoneman and is just immediately smitten by her. So with all these Cameron and Stoneman brothers and sisters falling for each other, it's kind of like, a star-crossed Romeo and Juliet thing, except that, one of the sides of the conflict is objectively right and the other side is objectively shitty. A kind of a funny face she makes in the photo. Not sure a lot of people in the 1800s pose like that. But remember, Lillian Gish was perhaps the biggest film star of the time, and that's the kind of face she'd make to look all soft and dreamy or whatever. Still looks weird. But the real rhetorical point of the scene is when they go to the slave quarters where they're having dinner, which the movie says they get 2 of their 12 hours off for. The point here is not subtle. There are boundaries to their workday, and they get a generous break, which I guess if they were getting paid more than $0 for their labor might be something to remark on. Anyway, what happens when they get there is just super predictable considering everything about this movie. The slaves dance around just as happy as can be and fawn over the owners whom they seem to love. And that's it, just a quick drive-by of the slave quarters to establish that the South system of slavery makes everybody happy, including the slaves. But oh no, the next title card tells us that this happy arrangement is going to be disrupted by the gathering storm, which will threaten states' rights. Wait, states' rights? That sounds familiar. Am I to understand that the arguments made by conservatives to cover for their most egregious violations of people's rights extend all the way back to when they were used to apologize for slavery? Huh. Then Daddy Cameron looks at a newspaper talking about how the South will secede if the North wins the election. So, surprise, conservatives don't like elections and they get civil war-y. This movie just keeps right on predicting the future. Good job, movie. Then we get Stoneman having a meeting about politics in his library, which the card says his daughter never visits. And I don't know how to take that other than as a jab at her intelligence, but it never really pays off, so I'm not 100% sure. What I'm more sure of is that these two are a couple Yankees up to no good and trying to ruin the South, but where this gets really bad is where we're introduced to Lydia Brown, Stoneman's housekeeper. And buckle up. Now, when you look at Lydia, you might notice it seems ambiguous whether or not she's made up in blackface like a lot of the other actors in this movie. That's for a reason. And if you think you might have already guessed it and it's the worst reason you can imagine, you're probably on the right track. She is, as this movie describes her, a mulatto, meaning of mixed black and white parentage. And it turns out that mixed race people are core to this movie's message, so expect this thread to continue. Anyway, if you haven't found this movie racist enough, here is where it escalates its offensiveness just straight through the roof. Its depiction of mixed race people kind of pushes my buttons for personal reasons I won't get into, but just for anybody who's going to find this terrible. Basically, Sumter, the guy Stoneman was talking to, ends up in a room with Lydia, and she just behaves like a brazen temptress and then gets really mad when Sumter isn't having it. And just to tie it all together with a neat little bow, in case that was too subtle for us and we don't understand where this is going in the big picture, we get a title card reading, "The Great Leader's Weakness That Is a Blight to the Nation." And that means exactly what you think it does. Because Lydia manipulates Stoneman by acting distraught, probably accusing Sumter of something, and then coyly comes on to him. And of course he falls for it. Because she's his weakness and that makes her a blight to this nation. Now, it fades out before we really see anything, but it's pretty clear that they're in a physical relationship. So it sounds like this movie's premise is that Civil War era tensions and all the devastation it's causing to the U.S. are being caused not by, the fact that we're enslaving an entire race of people, and some people are starting to find that unconscionable, but because perfectly good white leaders are being corrupted by the wiles of mixed race women. Jesus Christ, fuck this movie. I mean, I knew it would be bad, I knew it would be racist, but I did not have mixed race women manipulated good white men into causing northern aggression on my bingo card. And again, I think I was just super wrong when, having watched this movie the first time, I thought it was a slow burn in terms of racism. I think maybe it was just the pace of the movie being slow in general and the fact that I was taking it in for the first time, I'm not sure. But even on that viewing, this one just slapped me right across the face and I absolutely hated it. Anyway, meanwhile, down south, the Stoneman brothers are saying goodbye to the Camerons. The older Stoneman brothers' love for the older Cameron sister is really blossoming, by the way, so I guess all the siblings are really, really falling for each other. How sweet and obviously meant to highlight the tragedy of this just totally avoidable war, kind of like Jack and Rose on the Titanic, except that, I guess, according to this movie, the iceberg is being caused by those people and the white men who fall for them. So I'm going to take a break here. My voice is getting a little bit tired. I'll record more of this later. But this is, we're still in the first half of this movie, just to give you a sense of the structure. This movie has a first half, which is the Civil War era, and the second half, which is after the Civil War era. But within that first half, we start off with a more personal level of storytelling, which is the Camerons and Stonemans meeting each other, making friends and stuff like that. And then we expand to the more big picture historical part. And so I'll get into that next time. I'll see you when I start recording again. All right, so here we are back to see the movie expand the scope of its story from the personal one about the Camerons and the Stonemans to the broader scope of history that's about to come barreling down on them. So storytelling innovation of Birth of a Nation? Don't know, barely care, still fuck this movie. In this case, instead of the Titanic, we have Abraham Lincoln signing an order to call for 75,000 troops, which kind of makes him the big baddie, except that after signing, he gets sad and appears to start praying. I didn't know whether I was saying this right at first because it seemed a little bit out of place, but it does seem to be what the movie's going for. Because this movie actually ends up seeming pretty sympathetic to Abraham Lincoln in general. It portrays him less as evil and more as being manipulated by extreme Northerners like Stoneman and people like that. And I'd gone in expecting more overt hatred of Abraham Lincoln, this being a Southern Lost Cause movie, so that was kind of interesting. Maybe this movie wanted to kind of extend an olive branch to white people who thought Abraham Lincoln was a good president. Maybe portraying him as evil would be a little too divisive. I don't know. Maybe you got to pitch a big tent if you want to catch all the potential shithead racists. They live up north too, right? Also, side note, the title card says that we're going to be looking at a historical facsimile. This is something the movie does a few times. It seems like it has this thing for accurately recreating historical scenes and letting its audience know that's what it's doing. So, oh, interesting. But all that aside, the point here is pretty straightforward. To establish that Northern aggression is happening at the hands of Abraham Lincoln, and that this is kind of a new thing that basically amounts to a conquest of previously sovereign states. Title cards are pretty on the nose about that. This is the most obvious thing we'd expect to see in a Confederate sympathizing movie done in about the most straightforward terms possible, so we won't dwell too much on it. The only thing I would reinforce, just to make it abundantly clear, is that this is interjected right at the point in the story where the Camerons and Stonemans just said goodbye right after developing initial crushes and making good friends and stuff like that. So the movie is extremely on the nose at pulling on our heartstrings, with this sentimental little exchange right as the Northern war machine is about to bear down on all these people and ruin it for them. And so along those lines, our next scenes will be parallel ones of the Stonemans and Camerons both preparing to go off to war. First, we see the Stoneman brothers about to deploy. Their sister Elsie smiles and makes motions like, "Go shoot some bad guys for me," but then as soon as they leave, she runs off and cries. So we're just progressing the tragedy of these two families being caught up in the Civil War. Pretty basic stuff. Then we have our parallel scene down in Piedmont where the Camerons are about to be sent off, except this one involves a huge ball inside and a bonfire outside. The ball goes on for quite a long time, probably because that would have been a fun spectacle for moviegoers at that time, even though kind of boring for us to watch. It probably also cost a lot, so, better use that footage, DW. In the middle of this all, Ben Cameron, the movie's main character, and remember who else if you didn't skip ahead of that part, steps away from the festivities to kind of just be playful with his little sister. So once more, we're establishing a lot of sympathy for these characters. Definitely keep that in your back pocket as we go on. Oh, and he does that by dangling a Confederate flag over her. Ah, how cute. And speaking of Confederate flags, they bring in one baptized in glory at the Battle of Bull Run and just really over-the-top dote over it. And they present it to the camera in a way that you can just tell is meant for the audience. In case this movie had otherwise been unclear about where it was coming from in terms of being lost cause Confederate sympathizing trash. Anyway, the next morning we get the troops departing, and Ben Cameron shows up for another scene with his kid's sister, in case we hadn't laid the sentimentality of the relationship on thick enough so far. And just to make sure we connect all this cuteness to the abject racism of the Confederate South, he takes her over to see a flag that says, "Conquer we must, for our cause is just, victory and death," and she keeps playing with a little Confederate flag. Ah, how cute. So then the troops march out while the townspeople wave and celebrate. All very unremarkable, but notice how they make sure a few cheering black people are plopped right there where you can see them, kind of like those few always positioned just so at a Trump rally. Oh, how things just always stay the same. Mom sheds tears for her departing sons, and oh, just look at all those black people streaming out into the street to cheer for our boys in gray. The message is not subtle. As if you need me to lay it out for you, black people, at least the good ones, like the South the way it is and are happy to see the Northern invaders push back. Kid's sister hugs the Confederate flag because she just really misses her brothers already. Fuck you. Then we switch back up north for a kind of parallel scene where Elsie's telling her father that her brothers are off to war. This one, surprise, surprise, is much shorter than the long, drawn-out, sentimental departure we just saw down south with, way surprise, surprise, far less in the way of tear-jerking goodbyes. Elsie does seem kind of sad, but old Austin Stoneman seems pretty casual, almost stone-faced about the whole thing. Pun barely intended. And so while broadly speaking, these parallel scenes are supposed to just show us the tragedy of friends being pitted against each other by the Civil War, kind of this neutral, high-minded thing, I guess, it's very clear who we're supposed to be sympathizing with. Surprise, surprise. After this, we suddenly jump 2 years into the future where Ben Cameron gets a letter from his kid's sister. So we're just going to keep pulling at this sentimental thread for all it's worth. Wonder if any tragedy is going to come from all this? Actually, no, I don't. Turns out she's a big girl now and just can't wait to see him again. Along with keeping this storyline brazenly sappy, this prepares the audience for the fact that she will now be played by an older actress. They even cross off little and put big on her letter. Also, just love how they put kisses in parentheses by the X's. Kind of seems like that was there for the audience. Then we're back home where little sis is going to hear his letter back. I guess they do a ceremonial reading and stuff. It seems like this serves to keep her at the front of our minds, foreshadowing, and also to conspicuously just parade her in front of us for a minute so we know that this new actress is her now. Makes sense, I guess, just seems a little silly when you see it. But now, irregular guerrilla forces are coming in to attack Piedmont. And let's be clear, as this movie definitely makes sure to do, that these irregular forces are full of black people. This is where we start to see one of the core points in this movie, which is Black people as a looming threat. And notice, this is the very first action of the Civil War we see. We literally skip over 2.5 years of war and go directly to the first time white Northerners stir up Black people to go menace a nice Southern town, which is, populated largely by white women after the men went to war. Wonder where this is going and why they focused on this? Actually, no, I don't. I trust that you're sharp enough to get the point, too. So these guys come riding into town like, look out, they're coming, and all the women go run inside to hide. I guess everybody's running into hiding, but, heavy emphasis on the women. We follow the Cameron sisters inside, including the little pet sister who's now all grown up, already paying off her heartwarming scenes with Big Brother by putting her in peril. When they run inside, old Dad Cameron is there with his pistol. It looks like he wants to do something about it, but the sisters seem to be telling him, no, calm down, Dad, you're just going to get yourself killed. Then 3 Union soldiers come running up to the door, and they're all, black. Now, this isn't all the soldiers in the invasion, but you can see what we're emphasizing. And curiously, these guys look like actual black actors instead of whites in blackface. I still wonder, I guess, both why D.W. Griffith cast actual black people for this part, and also just about these people's stories, how they got drawn into this movie, what they thought about doing it, and then how they felt about it afterward. But anyway, a lot is in the details in this scene. These guys, and this is obvious, are clearly not disciplined, orderly, chivalrous soldiers, like, good Southern boys in gray. They're in various levels of sloppy dress, one with no hat and his shirt unbuttoned, the other straight up shirtless with his uniform hanging off him. And they clearly look around in this sneaky way like they're up to no good. Considering white women are on the other side of the door, the insinuations are not subtle. What I find amazing in a very bad way is just how familiar this all looks. Because this is exactly the kind of race-baiting crime narrative that should be familiar to us today, right? You probably recognize the general chaos of minorities flooding into an otherwise nice, white, peaceful neighborhood, shooting everybody and menacing women. You recognize the casually sloppy dress that signals about the same thing as backward hats and pants hanging low. And we even have the dad in kind of a Charles Bronson or Bob Odenkirk position. Of course, he never goes full vigilante because this just isn't that kind of movie. But when we see him, we are definitely supposed to feel the same kind of secondhand helplessness that those movies pay off through vigilantism. He so badly wants to be a man and stand between his daughters and black people. Oops, I meant criminals. But there's just nothing he can do. But of course, those black soldiers aren't operating by themselves. As this title card signals, they're being brought in and stirred up by a scalawag officer. And that, by the way, is a term for a white person who opposes the South and supports Reconstruction and stuff. So I don't know, to me, I might be wrong. I always thought of scalawag as just a general term for a ruffian or a ne'er-do-well or something, but that's what it means. So basically, white Union officers are bringing in former slaves to stir up chaos, just like what Democrats and radical lunatic leftists today are doing with illegal immigrants. So barely a coat of paint over the exact same racist rhetoric. It's just all so depressingly the same. Anyway, the Unionist/black guys are running around menacing women, but luckily ours escape into a hidden cellar, so they just kind of rough up Dad and trash the house, I guess. But oh, what luck! A group of Confederate troops finds out what's going on. So they rush into the rescue, and the cowardly Unionist/black guys are all, oh shoot, and run off. Apparently they're not even soldiers as much as hooligans who like to rough up old men and harass women. Not super subtle propaganda. And we're not shown this scene at random. The movie skipped over a ton of the war to focus on it for one simple reason. It's the core point of the entire movie. This back-and-forth engagement is the formula by which it views the problems the Civil War caused the South and the solution for fixing it. Agitators, and you know what I mean by agitators, come in to threaten the innocent and disrupt the social order. Just really fuck up the otherwise perfectly idyllic and innocent South. And the problem is that they're doing it with the power and legal endorsement of the Union. So what are these invaded communities supposed to do? They're fully backed into a corner. So the only option is for gallant Southern gentlemen to rise up and come to the rescue. And yes, these gentlemen are official Confederate soldiers. For now. But it doesn't take much imagination to see where this is headed. After the Civil War is over and the Confederate Army's been disbanded, somebody will have to rise up in a less official capacity, in secret, by doing something to hide their identity. If you haven't connected the dots yet, I'm talking about the Klan. In short, this exchange provides the racist thesis for this racist movie. With Union forces corrupt and Southern forces disbanded, the Klan is literally the only option for protecting the innocent. And while we're not there yet, because, the war is still raging and everything, this exchange provides the template for justifying and romanticizing the Klan. I don't want to skip ahead and give away too much, but this scene is just super pivotal in establishing what this movie's all about, And so pointing that out to you will give you the thematic framework to absorb what you're seeing in the rest of this movie. But in any event, the Confederate rescuers save the day and all the womenfolk happily come out to thank them, conspicuously including a household slave, just to keep reminding us that the good slaves love their masters and that this movie has black friends. You know, we're not being racist or anything. This character is named Mammy, by the way, and she's obviously played in blackface, apparently by a white woman, not a burly white man. I actually looked that up, and now you know. On the battlefield, the little Colonel Ben Cameron gets letters from home and glances at his picture of Elsie Stoneman, who's still striking her obvious Lillian Gish glamour pose. Boy, that was hard to say. We then get a title card calling war bitter and useless, though I think it's in less of a general anti-war sentiment way and more of a we hate Northern aggression way. And also, it looks like the chums will meet again, so apparently we're about to pay off that Northern friend pitted against the Southern friend thing. This is done in about the most ham-fisted way possible, though who knows if it would have come off that way to the original audience, what with the language of film being newer back then and stuff. And that is by having those two younger brothers from before meet on the battlefield. Confederate Duke Cameron gets shot down, and Todd Stoneman is about to come finish him off with a bayonet when all of a sudden, what do you know, he recognizes his old pal. But in the middle of this, he gets shot and then falls and dies next to his friend. Pretty tragic. Kind of like a friendship version of Romeo and Juliet, except, you know, one side of the conflict is objectively right and the other is objectively shitty. It really looked like they were about to kiss, but probably not. If you're still as deep into racism as this movie obviously is, then not being homophobic is probably really going to kick your ass. Of course, the Cameron family is sad to get the news, so there's a scene of them being sad. And so do the Stonemans, though our villain Austin Stoneman just kind of makes this face instead of crying. Hard to read what that is. Does he really just not care that much? Is he opportunist about this whole thing? Or is it just kind of grim determination for revenge? Hard to tell with these evil abolitionist rabble-rousers, right? But no time for that, because we have to shift more of our sympathy back to the Confederate Camerons who, boo-hoo, have to sell all the fancy things they got from their slaves to support the cause of owning slaves. Poor, poor babies. They're even dressed in kind of raggedy clothes. So, you know, they're experiencing almost a fraction of the poverty that they willfully subjected their slaves to every single day. Did I mention poor babies? Anyway, Elsie Stoneman is about to head out to a military hospital, and we get mention of a great conqueror marching to the sea. You know, Sherman's March of the Sea from history. Look it up if you need to, I guess. We see women and children being sad and devastated because, you know, look at what the Union Army is doing. Such typical Confederate victim playing stuff, it just doesn't really deserve much commentary, right? So let's talk about the filmmaking here instead for a minute. It is pretty impressive how Griffith uses this long shot to show us the scale of the invasion. He'd staged an impressive number of people, but you can also see how it's a limited column of extras and there are like 2 buildings with smoke coming out of them. This is something he's famous for, which is creating the illusion of larger scale events with limited resources. But anyway, now back to the brazen racist Confederate apologetics. We get a title scene about the bombardment of Atlanta, and if you've ever seen a Lost Cause adjacent Civil War movie, you know where this is going. More gratuitous footage of how horrible war is, especially when Northerners come in and bust up your slavery ring. And look, as a side note here, I'm not trying to heroize the North. It might sound that way by comparison to the South, but I'm really not. Our whole country has a history of being racist as fuck, and a lot of the largest scale pushback against slavery and about admitting slave states had to do with labor protection for white workers. Also, the North, like the rest of the world, was very happy to look the other way and buy cheap cotton. So it all just sucked back then, especially for black people. I'm just saying, if you're the South and you were most invested in subjecting an entire race of people to lifelong grinding misery without pay, then maybe don't come and cry to me about anything, especially when it's the consequences of your own fucking actions. But for somebody who did, I guess, decide to make a whole movie crying about it, Griffith is clever about using smoke and split screens to make the devastation look massive with a limited number of people. Still, fuck him all the same. Oh, also, the middle Cameron brother dies with this weirdly happy, creepy look on his face. Kind of a strange acting choice, I don't know. A more devastating footage, and then we get an announcement that we're in the last great days of the Confederacy. I assume meaning the last difficult days. I'm not sure if it's a play on the word gray as in the color of their uniforms. Probably not. It also says they only have parched corn for their rations. Parched corn, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, is basically corn nuts, except, you know, without the flavor you'd get on them if you bought them from the store. So our poor brave Confederate soldiers aren't getting much to eat, you know, because of all the Northern aggression. So again, we're sad because the South is now miserable because they're being invaded. Straightforward stuff. What's interesting, though, here is that we're already near the end of the Civil War, and we never even really saw much of it. After setting up that it was caused by opportunistic Northerners for no reason and that it tore apart families and friends, the only parts we actually see are 1. An invasion of an unarmed southern town by menacing, apparently licentious black men turned loose by the Union until they're driven out by proto-KKK Confederate soldiers, and 2. General misery caused to the South as we come toward the end of the war. Now, it is obvious that this is just brazen lost cause propaganda meant to minimize the horrors of slavery and establish sympathy for the South. That kind of jumps right off the screen and waves in your face, right? But what I find interesting is just how brazen this movie is about cherry-picking the events of the war to do that. It just shows us these couple things, and the problem is, if you're just sitting there in a theater absorbing this movie for what it is, you might take for granted to some extent that this is the main thrust of the war and its consequences, especially if you're a 1915 audience member who, I don't want to say that they're, stupid people back then or whatever, but they didn't have access to the same level of information that we do today. And so this could really sink in as showing them what the war was about and establishing the popular narrative about the war in our country. I'm not saying it did that in isolation, but it probably had a big impact in what people thought the Civil War was and what its consequences were, which really isn't great. Anyway, this depiction of the South's woes continues with our poor Confederate boys holding a trench eating their parched corn. They're looking pretty raggedy, but that's because they're worn down from being so brave, not because they're just, sloppy like their black Union counterparts. Now, there's a food train coming to bring them more supplies, but it gets misled and cut off, and General Lee comes to the rescue. So all at once, we see 3 favorite lost cause aspects of the Civil War: Yankee treachery, Confederate misery, and Robert E. Lee bravely saving people. And then, of course, the little colonel enters into it. So let's see how that goes. I sure bet he'll be chivalrous and heroic. We see him getting his orders, and you'd think we're about to focus right on him, but no. The movie shows us just a ton of general battle scenes with not much commentary other than things like the field artillery and the mortars for broad context. Now, this is nice for a couple reasons. 1, I'm sure it was just a great thrill for 1915 audiences, and 2, I get to play through a few minutes of this goddamn movie without stopping to talk about anything. So, win-win. But now Ben Cameron is going to lead a charge against... Who's that? One of the Stoneman boys. These 2 families just can't stop running into each other, almost as if it were scripted that way. They run out in charge with Ben just so bravely leading the way. Then we cut to the Cameron family, for some reason posing like they're in a weird religious painting from the Renaissance. Dad's praying over a Bible or something, so I guess they're worried. Which I guess makes sense. The whole image just looks weird though. So armies clash and everybody keeps stabbing and whacking each other, just really going at it. Then we get an update that brave Ben took 2 trenches, but he only has a few men left. Which I guess, very effective of him. Maybe someday he'll be fit to lead the... Anyway, all hope is gone, it says, and Ben rushes out of his trench to give water to one of his fallen men. Which, just so gallant, so brave. Who better to one day lead the... In fact, the whole thing's so brave that even the Union starts cheering. Seems D.W. Griffith only knows one way to lay it on, and that's thick. So then our little colonel gets back with his men and... Charge! He runs up and shoves a flag down a Union cannon in what I assume is supposed to be an act of gallantry, and Phil Stoneman goes in and scoops him up. So I guess those Yankees aren't all bad. Now obviously this is about Phil knowing Ben personally from the long-standing friendship between the 2 families, but it also seems coded as showing him appreciating Ben's bravery. Which, did I mention Ben is brave? Because the movie sure does get that across. We get a title card saying war's peace and then the fallout of the battle. Just lots and lots of dead guys. So war's tragic. Got it. I'm guessing this is a lot of what Griffith was referring to at the beginning when he talked about showing evil stuff not to be sensational, but so that we can avoid it. Less slavery and racism and more piles of what would have been perfectly good white boys if only they weren't dead. Now, I don't mean to be callous to the deaths depicted here or to the general horrors of war. I know this is bad stuff. I just don't take it seriously how this movie uses it, and I kind of resent how it tries to use it. Also, one thing I just mentioned as a side note, because somebody might bring it up in the comments, it is hard to separate this from the fact that this movie was made in 1915, or released in 1915, and that this was, around the outbreak of World War I. So I don't know if there was some anti-war sentiment in here that was meant to, speak to the cause of isolationism, which a lot of conservatives at that time wanted to stay out of World War I. So maybe that was part of it. Not sure how this coincides with the making of the movie versus the release of it, but, it's that coincidence is kind of there. Then we discover that the war's been won by the northern aggressors. And on top of that, the Camerons get news that their second son is dead and their oldest one is in the hospital. So I guess whatever happened to our little colonel here had him in pretty bad shape. And so here they are being sad about it. And yes, I will say here, kind of like what I said about the bodies on the battlefield, that this is a legitimately sad scene, and I wouldn't begrudge the Camerons their grief. But this is the movie at its most insidious. It takes a scene that in isolation would for good reason pull at the heartstrings and attaches a lot of racist context to it. When you cry for the Camerons, you're crying for a slaveholding family. You're crying for the loss of sons who are fighting for the Confederacy and were killed by what's been cast as brazen northern aggressors who agitate ill-behaved black people. You're crying for the young pet sister whose attachment to her now hospitalized big brother was not only established in now familiar pre-tragedy formula, but constantly surrounded by emblems of staunch Confederate belligerents, which the two of them constantly celebrated together. It probably goes without saying that this is methodically hijacking your empathy, but what's really creepy is I could feel it doing it to me. Like, I could separate these scenes from the movie's broader context and the cause it was trying to draw me into, but I kind of sometimes had to consciously remind myself of that distinction. Like, don't get me wrong, I wasn't about to change how I felt about race and slavery in the Civil War. Please understand that. But it's creepy how easily your feelings can bleed from one thing to the other when you're not consciously paying attention to them. So I can see how this would have just been massively impactful on a 1915 audience that was, maybe relatively low information, not familiar with the language of cinema, and not consciously on guard against this. It's disturbing the effect this probably had on our society, or even worse, how it might have reflected and fed into what our society already was. In fact, this connection is made explicit with a title card reading War, the Breeder of Hate, followed by the two sisters being sad and little pet sister starting to go into a rage. Now, on its face, this could read as a general anti-war violence breeds violence thing, but everything about the context of this movie puts all the blame on northern aggressors and makes her fury kind of a justified reaction to what they did. Also just ties it to the entire cause of upholding slavery and racism and, the South's traditions and stuff like that. So forgive me for taking the broader context of war language as a pretentious smokescreen for all that stuff. Actually, I'm just kidding. If you're bothered by anything I just said, then your forgiveness or lack of forgiveness is just utterly meaningless to me. Then, as if this movie hadn't already won the gold medal for depicting coincidences, it turns out Elsie Stoneman is a nurse at Ben's hospital. Remember, Ben has a giant crush on her, or more precisely, a picture of her. She plays the banjo for Ben. I guess nursing was a different profession back then. And he really likes it, especially because it's her, I suppose. Then she pulls out a letter from her brother Phil asking her to make sure everything goes okay for Ben. Remember, Phil was not only Ben's existing friend from the visit, but the captain of the battle where Ben got injured. So just coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. Now, you might say this hospital thing is not a coincidence because Phil asked Elsie to look after Ben, but it says he's been committed to your hospital, which means she already worked where he happened to go, so I stand by it. Ben implicitly admits to being a weird creep by saying he's been carrying her around with him and then shows her the picture. But Elsie's body language seems like, okay, and then she stares off with what looks like a deeply uncomfortable stone-faced expression. I'm sure the movie takes this as romantic, but the whole thing is just creepy and intrusive. And the expression on her face, intentional or not, looks like a window into how women felt about what they had to quietly put up with back then. And today, sadly. Oh, how things stay the same. Anyway, Ma Cameron comes to see Ben. Yankee conspicuously checks out a woman as she walks past, so I guess this movie is also characterizing white Union soldiers as perverts. Even though Ben's thing was just totally cute and not creepy. Soldier who looks confusingly like Abraham Lincoln tries to stop Ma Cameron, from going to see her wounded son, but she says shoot me if you want and he lets her through. So as usual, Yankees are heartless and Confederates are steadfast and dignified in the face of persecution. She finds him and they're happy, but then we learn that a secret influence is going to try to get Ben hanged as a guerrilla. So essentially, this pro-KKK movie is trying to contrive a dramatic tragedy out of the possibility of somebody getting lynched. You can't invent this level of non-self-aware irony. Elsie suggests asking for mercy from Abraham Lincoln, referred to here by the nickname the Great Heart. So they do that and Lincoln gives her a pardon. And there was much rejoicing. Then Elsie goes back to Ben's bedside, while another pervy Union soldier leers at her. And with Ma Cameron gone, the two are all alone. Ben leans in for a kiss and she's all playfully, no, you scamp. Because Union soldiers leering at her is gross, but Ben simping over her picture and then making a move at her while she's at work is cute. Ma goes home and tells Pa, who's healing in what looks like way too much of a blanket for the South, but then again, I'm Alaskan, so what do I know? and there's much more rejoicing. Then back to big picture history, we have Lee's surrender to Grant, which I'm guessing the movie does not see as a good thing. Lee looks all stoic and dignified, while Grant just oozes slouching, cigar-chomping arrogance. Because of course. Then a title card calls this the end of state sovereignty. Because of course. And as if we need this clarified, I think I've mentioned it before, this just shows us in the clearest possible terms what absolute bullshit states' rights is. Like, what should it mean to us if a state wants the right to violate the rights of others? Yet over and over, this is what states' rights is trotted out to justify, tracing back to justifying the practice of slavery. What a proud, proud tradition, you guys. Anyway, little Colonel Ben Cameron is all better, so our two lovebirds say goodbye and Pet Sister is helping get a feast ready for him. It looks like all they're eating is beans, and Pet Sister puts strands of raw cotton all over her to be like furs. Get it? Because they're poor and she's just really trying for her big brother? How adorable. Even though he's going to end up leading. Now, Ben, when he gets back, just can't believe how badly his home has been wrecked by northern aggression and, we'll just say, urban blight. And they're kind of stuck with it because nobody invented suburbs yet. He comes to the door and Pet Sis greets him. They check out how poor the other is and give a hug. But you can tell our little colonel is really pissed off by all this poverty that's being imposed on not black people. Then we head up north where our villainous Austin Stoneman is telling Lincoln they really need to stick it to the South. Like, hang people and everything. Lincoln insists on being nice, and Stoneman storms off, just not happy at all about that. This, by the way, is where we probably get our best look at Stoneman with a platform shoe I'd referred to earlier. Like, he was put together from spare parts of frailty and pretension. And the funny thing is, you can see the actor's legs are roughly the same length because he has to bend his knee to make the platform shoe work. Kind of weird. Lincoln's like, ooh, that guy, and then the South starts bravely rebuilding, with the help of a happy black person who's happily working along with them because they love their masters and were happy, at least the good ones. But just when everything was going great, by South losing the war standards, we get that fated night of April 14th, 1865. And if we aren't clear enough what that means, Austin and his remaining kids are off to the theater. And we all know nothing good happens in theaters with movies that have Abraham Lincoln in them. A lot of footage of the play, then Lincoln shows up and everybody just keeps cheering like crazy. So yeah, this Confederate movie does strangely like Abraham Lincoln. But then the bodyguard leaves his post so he can see the play better, which he really shouldn't have done. This guy in real life, by the way, fully left the building and got drunk, said Abraham Lincoln gave him permission to do it. But maybe this movie didn't want to show somebody drinking. Slavery apologetics fine, but no drinking. I think we all know what happens next. John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln, shouts his thing, and runs away while pandemonium ensues. Stoneman seems just a teensy bit pleased to hear about this, and Lydia, the mixed-race woman who corrupted him, literally does an evil ha-ha-ha thing with her hands and tells him he's now the greatest power in America. God, I hate this. And you can probably guess how things are going to go with Lincoln dead and the villainous, vengeful Stoneman in charge, what with his liking of black people. And as if to really drive this point home, our Southerners get all freaked out and say, "Our best friend is gone. What is to become of us now?" And with that on-the-nose dramatic question hanging in the air, we end part 1 of the movie. So where part 1 showed us the horrors of the War of Northern Aggression, part 2 shows us the aftermath, with the Cameron family at the mercy of the lunatic left, extreme abolitionists. And with them stuck in such a tight spot, what is there to do except assemble the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys? The Klan. Boy, how everything just always stays the same. So second part, Reconstruction, the agony which the South endured, blah blah. Do I need to keep reiterating that this is just an openly stated pity party for the Confederate South? Because I feel like that's getting unnecessary. Then, do we ever get what is just quite the title card? This is an historical representation of the Civil War and Reconstruction period and is not meant to reflect on any race of people today. Then an example of what a racist Woodrow Wilson was and why he and this movie had such a cozy relationship. Basically, he says, not to be racist, but people came down from the north to mess things up for all races. Notice I said all of them, so not being racist. To use the black population. Also, it was a problem when black people held office, but only because they didn't know how to do it right. Not to be racist. Oh, and the whole point was to overthrow the South and put whites under the heel of the blacks. So the more things change, the more not to be racist remains the same. This is what I was referring to when I said that the Piedmont invasion scene was the thesis of this movie. The white officers leading black soldiers in to harass and subjugate the whites is a direct microcosm for how adventurers swarmed out of the North to rile up black leaders and even get them into office. So this text is just explicitly spelling out what that scene had been insinuating. In fact, it explicitly spells out more. Because remember how I said that it was implying that, good Southern men had no choice but to rise up and protect their homeland and, womenfolk? Well, this spells that out too, with Wilson saying white men started the Klan out of a mere instinct for self-preservation. So, I wasn't speculating when I said that. I mean, I didn't remember this text when reviewing that part of the movie, but Birth of the Nation lays it on so thick you don't really need these on and those declarations. Yet, here we are anyway, I guess. Anyway, with Lincoln dead, now I guess we have an uncrowned king running things. Want to guess who it? Okay, you already know it's Austin Stoneman. And based on everything we know about Stoneman, this obviously heralds danger for the South going into Part 2. The movie clearly signals that he's surrounded by suck-ups and cane picker-uppers, and he even lets his mixed-race kind of girlfriend roam freely, just getting into everybody's business and corrupting other good white leaders. Careful, good white leaders. But we haven't even seen the worst of it yet, because Stoneman has a mulatto protege named Silas Lynch, a name that for sure wasn't a coincidence. This is probably as good a time as any to point out the absolute hard-on this movie has for hating on people of mixed black and white parentage. I say hard-on in the sense of general fixation, but does anybody else here pick up secretly horny for black women vibes? Kind of like homophobic preachers who totally aren't gay? These are the people this movie really doesn't like. I mean, it can do the not to be racist thing with regular black people. We're fine with them, they just need to live in their God-ordained place under the yoke of white people. But mixed race people, they just absolutely can't abide. So why is this? Probably no big secret. They represent what has to horrify racist shitheads more than anything else, which is couples race mixing. Every time we see a Lydia Brown or a Silas Lynch, we're reminded that a black person and a white person did it. Maybe even a black man and a white woman. God, I feel like I need a shower after recording this. But beyond visceral disgust, I think this is about a disruption to the expected social order. Even though this movie is totally not racist, it clearly communicates that black and white people have their places. For one, black people shouldn't be in this country because they cause so much discord, but if they are going to be here, the only way to maintain balance is to keep them in their proper role under the supervision of and working for whites. Anything outside that just throws everything out of whack. So what could be more irredeemable than a black and white person marrying each other? The act itself is taboo, but then it permanently releases upon the world somebody who, by their very nature, defies racial categories. Maybe even shows us how fundamentally arbitrary and nonsensical the very idea of race is. So while this movie tries to present as condescendingly okay with black people, it can't even pretend to see mixed race people as anything other than gross and to slot them in as main villains. This is the Birth of a Nation at its absolutely most disgusting. It puts out the idea that real-life people are abominations created by weird lust and perpetuating weird lust. I can't even keep talking about this, and I'm not sure people want to hear more about it. I'm sure you've gotten the idea, so I'm just going to keep going. It's mind-blowing just how absolutely horrifying the movie is in this regard. Anyway, back to the story. Lydia sends Silas in to meet Stoneman. Silas keeps bowing and stuff until finally Stoneman says, "Don't scrape to me," basically meaning don't act all submissive. You're the equal of any man here. And keep in mind, this is the bad guy telling someone of another race that he's equal, and the movie has him doing it because he's the bad guy. I bring this up because it's easy to start to see Austin Stoneman, at least on an instinctive level, as a villainous character, partly maybe because the movie contrives a reason to depict him as a disingenuous schemer. But here, he's just being a decent progressive person, and the movie shits on him for that. But then again, I'm not sure that D.W. Griffith sees the difference between a decent progressive person and a disingenuous schemer. So it's just a moment to stop and remind yourself when you develop this instinct to, play into the movie's narrative and at least on a visceral level see someone as a bad person. It's kind of striking when he just is nice to a black or mixed race person and the movie wants you to dislike him for it. It kind of pulls you back from that, I guess. In fact, gasp, Stoneman even declares that blacks will be fully equal to whites, which fills Lydia with just so much cackling glee. Senator Sumner tries his best to touch a mixed-race woman's hand, just to be polite, but and then suggests a less dangerous policy than treating all people as equals. Gotta moderate, right? Of course, Stoneman isn't having it and says he's going to make Silas Lynch, as a symbol of his race, the peer of any white man living. Now, the point about equality is obviously good, but the way he fixates on Silas personally and tries to turn him into a symbol feels weird. And I guess the movie contrived it that way. Kind of an old-timey version of what reactionary conservatives think DEI is. Boy, how things just always stay the same. Then we get a title card explaining the big upcoming plot that will drive a lot of the continuing conflict. Stoneman is sick, so he's sending Silas down to aid the radical lunatic left, carpetbaggers, in helping illegal aliens commit voter fraud, organizing and wielding the black vote. Essentially, Silas is going to be the Darth Vader to Stoneman's emperor. By the way, sowing the wind is an expression from Hosea in the Bible for doing something reckless that's going to create a big mess. So basically, they're going to go down and encourage black people to be, like actual people with rights instead of just knowing their place, and thus destabilize the South with who knows what consequences. In fact, we pretty quickly get a hint of what these consequences look like, because even as this is all being set up, Silas starts leering at Elsie. So see, just an ounce of power and he thinks it's his place to start moving in on a white woman. She catches him and he seems to do the 1800s version of my lady with a smarmy look on his face, then bows and excuses himself. Then poor old dad makes a show of not doing so well and she comes over to give him a hug. Weird. Okay. So Lynch heads down and sets up headquarters, wanna guess where? Piedmont, of course, exactly where the Camerons live. They better hurry and gentrify this place because it's about to all go to shit. He checks out his new digs with a black-faced soldier and a carpetbagger who literally has a carpetbag set right there in the middle of the frame because we weren't being on the nose enough. And according to the next title card, his first order of business is to incite black people to stop working. So in case you forgot, this movie is racist. Notice the transition is not from slavery to fairly paid labor. The movie seems to conflate slavery with work in general, at least for black people, such that to end slavery is to encourage people to be lazy. And Silas does this by, and I'm serious, actually going up to someone and saying, hey, stop working and go play. He actually tries to grab this one guy's pitchfork, but the guy's like, no, you can't have it. I'm going to keep working because I'm one of the good ones. So get out of here, you. The movie really likes to show us the good ones and how much they like to get out there in the fields and do their work. Then we see a group of newly unemployed black guys spinning and dancing in a silly stereotypical way, just having a good old time, and some of Silas's carpetbaggers grab a couple dudes out in the field and are like, hey, why don't you stop working and go join those guys over there? They're having fun. So they put down their hoes, and by hoes I mean farming tools, and do just that. But how, you might ask, are they going to survive if they're unemployed? Well, don't worry your little head over that because the movie covers it with the next title card. It informs us that the Freedmen's Bureau is giving them free supplies, which is characterized as the charity of a generous North misused to delude the ignorant. In other words, the federal government is raising up the first round of welfare queens. And kings, I guess. I'm sure you get the point. But what's wild is how right on down the line the construction of this rhetoric is to what we see today. Allow me to belabor it on screen so you can see how it lines up. You have a group of people who are subjected to large-scale race-based abuses that put them at an absurd disadvantage. You have people recognizing that this is a problem and proposing the government should do something to remedy the situation. At this point, I'd say everything makes sense, right? We're trying to make restitution for an act of harm done to people and to curtail a cycle of generational poverty. And if you're the kind of person who stuck around to this point in the video, I'm pretty sure you see how this is relevant to modern times. It's not like racism is over and black people are more or less doing fine, maybe catching up from long past setbacks caused by slavery, or failing to catch up because of absent fathers, a lazy, disrespectful culture, or whatever not to be racist reason you want to give. Their heads have been actively held underwater by neo-slavery, Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, redlining, over-policing, and on and on and on. And if you don't agree with that or it sounds unfamiliar to you, go look into it a little bit. I'll put some links in the description. And if some remedial reading doesn't change your mind about this, you're probably just going to sit there with your arms crossed being pissy through this whole video anyway, if you're still here. In other words, this video isn't for you, it's about you. But where it gets interesting is that some people don't want this stuff done, but also totally don't want to be racist about it. So what do? They deny the problem. Sure, things aren't perfect for minorities, but is anything perfect for anyone? So they just need to do what anybody facing obstacles should do. Start at square one and work their way out of it. Pick themselves up by the bootstraps. They cast the solution as a problem. They don't need a hand out, they need a hand up. You're just making them dependent on welfare so they won't ever learn to work, as if that's something they need to learn. Gross. In fact, any government assistance beyond giving them room to grit their teeth and claw their own way up is going to create the very culture of laziness and fatherlessness, not to be racist, that's keeping them poor to begin with. Never mind the fact that measured social programs are vital for helping people get out of poverty, and white people use them to get where they are without realizing they were ever there. And they cast the intentions as insincere. Progressives are just trying to bribe black people by giving them welfare in exchange for political support. Most of us are well familiar with the language of this, and I think we usually know when it's about to come, right? The moment somebody opens their mouth to object to extending the same benefits we all benefit from to minority populations. So maybe I'm belaboring the obvious here. But what really struck me is how clearly this movie used the same vocabulary to express this same idea back in 1915, and essentially used it to justify slavery. Like, I can comprehend how somebody out of ignorance could legitimately think these 3 points make sense today. They can come off as intuitive if you learned a very bad sanitized history of the last 150 years. Of course, a person should take responsibility for learning better than that, don't get me wrong. But I had always assumed that some version of, everything's been equal for the past 150 years, they just need to work their way up like everybody else, was kind of essential to this argument, that you needed that bit of ignorance in there, or at least the obscurity that comes from time having passed and not knowing how much racism continued. So for this movie to use the exact same rhetoric, line by line, to justify telling former slaves that they just need to stay out in the field, it just really blew my mind. At this point in history, the disadvantage faced by these recently freed slaves is so dramatic and obvious there's simply no muddying it. After generations of slavery, they were released to abject poverty with no place to live other than their slave masters' quarters, no employment prospects other than to return to the kind of work they've been freed from and hope their slave masters would suddenly act like fair wage-paying employers. This makes it absolutely clear that some kind of assistance was just a necessity, like you can't just turn them loose and say, go be self-sufficient. There simply was no plausible avenue for them to get their feet on the ground or to advocate for themselves without financial help and specific on-the-ground measures to actually execute the abolition of slavery, right? Like, what were they supposed to do? Yet even with the facts this clear, without any of the murk of obfuscating whitewashed history that justifies regressive racial policies today, this movie still produced the same line of reasoning. It still suggested that the best thing, the only thing for freed slaves to do, was to keep working at what could only have possibly amounted to de facto slavery. It still suggested that this government charity was bad for them, and it said that this was being misused by the North to delude them. This movie makes these points abundantly clear, even if not all of them right in the text here, and if you haven't seen it yet, you will. So the fact that the same points that were used to argue against reparations, welfare, and DEI today were used over a century ago to argue against giving anything to recently freed slaves tells me that maybe this is more about racism than about legitimate confusion over our nation's post-Civil War history. And the fact that this reasoning actually originated with this argument and just continued on to be applied to this one should tell us even more. This argument did not start in good faith, and no matter how different the situation might be now, don't you maybe want to pause and wonder why you're allowing yourself to inherit a rhetorical tool that was crafted to justify keeping slaves in slavery and has persisted in almost the exact same form to this day? Like, what are the odds that this shitty argument, conceived for this shitty reason, and continuing on to serve unaltered as a shitty knee-jerk reaction to every kind of progressive social change it's confronted by, is suddenly going to be a reasonable reaction to current calls for social change? I mean, I guess that could happen, but I wouldn't want to count on repeating D.W. Griffith to eventually make me right by accident. And if that's your strategy, maybe you agree with him more than you want to admit. Anyway, here's the welfare station, and they're just greedily getting all their free stuff, being all rowdy and rude about it and everything. And then we go on to a bunch of black Union soldiers marching past the Cameron's house. Ben and Pet's sister bump into them. No way they didn't see him, come on. So the soldier gets all pushy about it, and Silas Lynch steps in to say, this sidewalk belongs as much to us as it does to you. So yeah, the bad guys are saying black people should be allowed to walk on sidewalks too, and our good guys are like, ooh, we really don't like that. Just in case you've forgotten, this movie's racist. Don't want you to lose track. Anyway, while Darth Vader is busting up people who don't want to share the sidewalk with non-whites, the Emperor decides he needs to be somewhere warmer for his health. So where does he move? You guessed it, Piedmont, where the Camerons live. They all pile into the Cameron's house, and a black guy in a suit tries to make Mammy carry his bags. She shakes her fist at him and says, quote, yo northern low-down black trash, don't try no airs on me. So basically, know your place and don't try to act like a fancy white guy. And it's not racist because it's a black character saying it to another black character, even though it's written by a white guy. Pet's sister and Elsie Stoneman just hit it right off, apparently. Then, in case we didn't get enough it's not racism because it came from a black character racism, the movie dials it straight up to Mammy telling us how crazy those free black fellows from the North are. And yeah, that's the hard R I'm blurring out. Then Silas and Ben meet again in an encounter titled The Black's Condescension. And, want to guess what our evil Silas Lynch does that's so condescending? Would you like to take a jab at it before we move on? I guess pause if you want to stop and think about it, because here goes. He politely takes off his hat and shakes Elsie's hand. Then he tries to shake Ben's hand, and Ben just crosses his arm and looks away very piss-offedly. So Silas chokes down his frustration, smiles and gives them a polite bow, then leaves. All of this condescendingly, I guess. Now remember, the guy on the left is being the bad guy right now, and the guy on the right is being the good guy. We are supposed to sympathize with the one crossing his arms and glaring because someone tried to shake his hand, while the other guy is so terrible the movie makes a title card about his condescension. Yep. But setting aside snark for a moment, it's worth pointing out that this movie did resonate with its audience. So people apparently were actually horrified that a black person walked up to white people and tried to shake their hands. Including a white woman, of course. Lynch didn't stop there, though. Apparently he is just straight up all the way evil. He's going to betray Austin Stoneman and lead his own people by an evil way, strange phrasing, just to get a throne of vaulting power. So obviously you can't trust one of them. Try to be nice to them and they'll turn on you. And of course the movie goes out of its way to say that he's a bigger traitor to his own people. And this movie always does that. Says that doing anything progressive hurts black people as much as anybody else. Because it's not being racist. Also interesting that it's clearly referring to black people as his own people. Doesn't say so in as many words, but it contrasts them to his white patron. So I guess we know where this movie lands on the question of which one you are if you have parents of both races. Now, of course, it is legitimate for somebody of diverse racial background to feel like they identify more with one race or the other. And a lot of times somebody might feel themselves perceived as more black than white just when they're out in public. They might feel themselves carrying that identity with them whether or not they want to. But that's for each person to sort out for themselves and for others to try to listen and understand. But I don't think that's where this movie's coming from. Are you picking that up? Are you picking up that vibe? Anyway, to illustrate his duplicity, Silas is all bows and smiles until he gets out of the room, and then he shakes his fist at Austin from behind the closed door. So, not a sincere bone in his body. Try to be nice to him and he'll just take advantage of you. Let that be a lesson to you, white people. Then we get the Southern Union League rally before the election. Wonder what this will be about? Let's check it out. All right, here we are, more or less what I thought. A bunch of carpetbaggers stirring up a bunch of black guys. Most of this is pretty direct, but notice how the white guys are sitting there pointing to these signs as if instructing the black guys on their talking points like they're in kindergarten. This seems to be indicating a certain amount of illiteracy on the part of the black people at this event, along with suggesting that, these aren't concerns that arise organically from the local black population. They aren't worried about equality and stuff like that. These are just drilled into their minds by opportunistic, meddling outsiders. I'm kind of reading between the lines, but not by much. We know this is what they're getting at, right? The way these guys are condescendingly pointing at the signs explaining what's on them is a pretty in-your-face detail. Also, this is presented as a very rowdy event with everybody getting kind of out of control. Like it's people all whipping their hands in the air being crazy. Except this guy front and center in the wide shot who looks just extremely unenthusiastic about being in this movie. If that's the case, good for him. Just kind of weird how he's there, I don't know. I don't want to put too much of a fine point on this because I'm sure you get it. You know what's going on in this scene. But, this movie's suggesting, of course, that black and white people in the South got together just fine. Everybody knew their place. Everybody was happy. And then a bunch of abolitionist ne'er-do-wells came in and stirred things up. And in doing so, they are sowing the wind. They're creating problems that they don't realize, and they're going to just get out of hand. And this, like a lot of stuff in this movie, you could kind of see it working within the narrative. This is a shitty representation of black and white people and just of racism, but it also has real life implications. In this case, I think setting up justifications for why black people should not be in office and why you need things like literacy tests for voting. This movie did real harm. We're going to see more of that as we go on. Anyway, Darth Vader and the Emperor enter the room, so things are about to get real. I guess Stoneman's the guest of honor. Good for him. But Lynch does all the talking and gets the room just super riled up. Then a title explaining what I think we know they were getting at, giving black people the vote. This is just put up straight with no commentary, as if it trusts its audience to get why that's bad. Then back at the Freedmen's Bureau, where they give all that ruinous welfare, the movie finds the most stereotypically racist way possible to script a black guy telling a white guy that he doesn't even care about the vote, he's just there for bribes. So are we getting the point yet? But in the middle of all this horrible equality, we're reminded that our two lovebirds are in love and that that's very nice. Get it? Lovebirds? Well, you probably won't, but you will in about 2 seconds. The two are out walking in the woods when our little Colonel Ben goes and grabs a bird and holds it out so Elsie can kiss it. A weird gesture must be a product of its time. That being a time when people were far less concerned about how gross and diseased birds are or whether they've consented to join your weird threesome. Ben tries moving the bird and sneaking in, so I guess this disregard for consent extends just in all directions. And she's like, "Oh, you rascal," and isn't having it. So she goes back to her room and keeps getting it on with the poor bird. I mean, if nothing else, do they not realize that thing's probably going to die? But before that situation goes too far, we thankfully fade to our far less spicy bee couple, Phil Stoneman and Margaret Cameron. Phil just walks up to her and starts gesturing, but she has no use for that. Just kind of walks away. Maybe he should have come prepared with a bird. But the real problem, it turns out, is that Margaret is upset that her brother died in the war. Women, am I right? This gets made explicit with a title card, of course, reading, "Still a North and South, Pride Battles with Love for the Heart's Conquest." The idea is acted out by Elsie constantly going back and forth from almost kissing Ben to turning away to being like, "Oh, but I love you," and then they finally kiss. Aw, cute little racists. Ben sees her home, partly to be chivalrous and I guess partly because of all the urban blight. Then they part ways and we get one of those brief scenes of them each on their own being like, "Oh, I'm so in love." But uh-oh, election day. And according to this title card, all the black people get to vote while leading whites are not. So that's how we're characterizing this thing. Of course. First thing we have is a black guy sticking in his vote, then sneakily putting in another one. So, the exact accusation certain people like to make today. Wow, how things just always stay stupid. Then, of course, a white guy goes to vote and a black Union soldier stops him. This happens over and over and over, and even Pa Cameron gets turned away. What this seems to clarify, at least to me, is that the leading whites on this title card who aren't allowed to vote are not just Confederate leadership. This isn't just punishment for treason. This is whites being excluded from the vote on a broad scale, to cheat at the election. And also probably reverse racism or something like that. And the predictable result is that the black population and carpetbaggers sweep the state. Boy, look at all that excitement. And Silas Lynch is even elected lieutenant governor. Now, you might recognize that this is somewhat reflective of actual history. Shortly after the Civil War, I think at least about 1,500 black men were elected to public office. So it's not like what a lot of people think where, slavery ended and progress was just this slow, steady upward slope. And, it's kind of culminated with people being elected to public office in recent years, say like post-civil rights or whatever. There actually was a lot of political progress made early on, but shitty white people came and stamped it out. So what this movie's doing is contending with that in a kind of obvious way. And that is by seeing this not as an organic result of progress, you give people equality and they are going to be represented in politics, but as some insidious plot by carpetbaggers and, ne'er-do-wells just to cheat at elections and push white people down. This gives the audience a framework by which to dismiss that progress and to see it as a bad thing, see it as this aberration by people who are just trying to cheat and put people into public office who weren't ready for it, not to be racist. And not only that, but to be immediately suspicious of any non-white person they see elected within their own time. And so this movie is not just depicting a racist story in isolation. It's justifying and contributing to our nation's history of stamping out advances in equality. It sucks and I don't like it. But anyway, back to the story. I'd said that Lynch is elected lieutenant governor. So what does he do first? Well, what do you think he does? Black character in an extremely racist movie gets elected to a position of power. You got it yet? Well, in case you didn't, the movie immediately announces it with a title card saying his love looks high. And in case you didn't know what that meant, it clarifies by showing him staring at Elsie Stoneman. So yeah, first thing he wants to do, the way he looks high, meaning tries to aim above his social standing, is go after a white woman. Try to be more basic racist movie. Oh, and of course Elsie is Ben Cameron's girl, so this time it's personal. But in all seriousness, I think it's obvious this was done deliberately to raise the stakes of the movie in a really ugly way. When you get the audience invested in Ben's interest in Elsie and then show Lynch coming after her, you are training them to feel threatened by the idea of one of them coming for your women. The more I watch this movie, the more I just absolutely hate it and take back thinking it was a slow burn. It sucks. Anyway, the black rabble raises Lynch above their heads to cheer him while Stoneman looks on and smiles. Oh, if only he knew what he'd unleashed by trying to be too nice to one of them. If you hadn't noticed, one of this movie's biggest rhetorical goals is to characterize what it means when a white person is nice to a black person. So obviously, with all this villainous equality going on, our protagonists are going to have to step in and do something about it. Storytelling 101, right? Except in this case, the rising action is good things happening and we identify with the people who are trying to stop it. Thus we get the little colonel relaying all these outrages to a bunch of old white guys. Gee, I wonder if this is going to lead to him starting So we get the harrowing tale of a white person being tried by a black judge and jury. So this movie, of course with no sense of irony, concocts a nightmare scenario that's literally the mirror image of what black people have actually gone through as a matter of practice across the history of this country. And this is shown in a cartoonish scene where someone gets off the stand and celebrates with a jury. So no sense of propriety, just a bunch of rabble-rousing friends using the courts to pick on white people. Also, black soldiers are just randomly abusing white people left and right because of course. On top of that, their faithful family servant is punished for not voting with the Union League and carpetbaggers. And yes, this idea of the faithful among former slaves is going to be a recurring thing. They grab him and tie him to a tree and whip him until another old black guy comes to save him and gets shot, even though he clearly wasn't in line with a gun. Once he falls, the black Union officers look around and run off. It's a common thing this movie shows naughty black characters doing. I'm guessing to depict them as stereotypically sneaky and cowardly. You know, pick on weak people but then run off before any real fighting happens. Ben Cameron is just getting super fired up and the spotlight focuses on him striking a dramatic pose. Wonder if he's about to start the poor old man dies and the faithful soul is upset about it. So he gets Pa Cameron and they go tell Ben Cameron along with his gathering of white people who just might end up founding the... So basically this movie is going full throttle on acting like it's not racist and neither is the Klan because they have black friends. Let's move along. To the riot in the Master's Hall. Oh boy. So this scene is going to be roughly what you expect. You know, that courtroom scene was kind of a precursor to it, where black people can't have any level of official authority without acting out of control and turning everything into a riot. In this case, they have majority representation in the state house. So this is the result of the political cheating done by the carpetbaggers to put black people in power. You know, the very anarchy that Ben Cameron might have to found a secret organization to get under control. And notice a couple things about this. First, they call the state house the Master's Hall, which just immediately casts it as something belonging to white people and being invaded by black people, and implies the slave-master relationship is fundamental to how all of society is rightly ordered. Shows how deep this bullshit is ingrained in their heads. They can't help themselves from making everything about slavery, just like a Star Trek fan can't stop themselves from talking about TIE fighters and stuff. Second, this is referred to as an historical facsimile, which I'd mention it likes to do. It comes off as, and maybe is meant to come off as, just an innocent fascination with historical recreation. And sometimes maybe it is. Sometimes maybe the movie just likes to get those details right for fun. But here they sneak in something else. Because this riot in the Master's Hall is just totally made up. It never happened, and this movie is using it to encourage white racists to think that black people can never be in charge of anything, and when they are, everything just goes to total shit. And I can't help but thinking that this historical facsimile thing applied to this completely made-up event, slanderously made-up event, is meant to give it a certain amount of credibility. They're trying to bleed in how they recreated the building with the event itself. Now, is this recreation of the 1871 house floor accurate in terms of set design? Maybe. But I guarantee that this historical facsimile language is meant to suggest that these events actually happened. In fact, it calls these historic events. So Griffith is painting a fictional racist picture of the past in order to encourage people to be racist in the future. I'm glad he's dead. So what does he show happening? Well, to start with, they kind of lounge around eating turkey legs and sneaking drinks of hard liquor. One even takes his shoes off and sticks his bare feet on the desk until the speaker rules you have to wear shoes. Later, they also just kind of dance around and be rowdy while civilized white people look on helplessly. So basically just the most outlandish things you could imagine the dumbest racist would assume black people would do in public office actually committed to film. Well done, sir. Then they decide all whites have to salute black officers. And I see two ways to read this. One, that people are supposed to salute officers in general, and this movie just hates the fact that this rule is being applied to black people. Or two, that the movie suggests that this rule is being made up just to spite white people. Neither one surprises me coming from this movie. Also, of course, they legalize interracial marriage. Oh no, suggests the movie. And it shows black guys leering at white women because this is actually all about them coming for the women. Oh, how the rhetoric never changes. And they just break out into a bunch of lawless hooting and hollering about that. Then, later, the grim reaping begins. So we're going to see what becomes of this equality. And this is going to be bad. If you've heard one specific thing about this movie, it's probably going to be this part. So remember Pet Sister? And remember how I've kept saying the movie was going to pay off the adorable sentimentality it had built up around her and the relationship with her older brother Ben? Well, you might think that happened when she was worrying about him being wounded in war. But no, this is leading to what it's really about. And it's vile. A trigger warning if you don't want to watch a young woman in peril of assault. So Pet Sister is going around still being oh so adorable, showing things to her potential future sister-in-law Elsie. Isn't she just the sweetest thing? And the trick is she actually is. The way this movie depicts her is super sweet and cute. So you're pinched between your instinct to take her depiction in these scenes at face value in isolation and the more substantial fact that this is all a setup for some pretty horrific racist storytelling. Anyway, here we go. We're soon introduced to the renegade Gus. Now, to be clear, the problem is not that he's black, according to the text on screen. It's that he was corrupted by the vicious doctrines of white Northerners. So yeah, we all know that the problem is that he's black, just with the thinnest layer of not to be racist painted over it. So there he is, hovering nearby all menacing-like. That's going to become important pretty soon. Lieutenant Governor Lynch, meanwhile, tries to normalize handshakes with white women, then leers as they walk away, and Ben Cameron just, isn't having it. Side note, earlier in this movie, I had found it unnerving how appealing it could make its white racist protagonist seem. But Ben's pivot from, dashing Confederate officer and adorable big brother to just seething racist ready to found the KKK. Oops, did I say the whole thing without a spoiler warning? Sorry. Anyway, to me at least, his turn is just so jarring that he comes off as horribly unlikable in these scenes. If only the people who like this movie weren't too racist to feel the same way. So Lynch looks back and forth between Elsie and Pet Sis. Just to make it clear, this isn't about him being love-struck, it's about him generally creeping on white women. And there's a scene that suggests the two are pretty uncomfortable about the whole thing. And this is the most insidious part about it. Women feeling unsafe around men is a real issue. There's a reason they prefer the bear. And looking into that and figuring out why is an important thing to tackle. But instead of addressing this in any meaningful way, instead of actually trying to understand the experience of women in society and how all men, any men, creeping on them or harassing them or making them feel uncomfortable is something we need to deal with, this movie just weaponizes the whole idea for the sake of being racist. Cue references to how the right today characterizes immigrants, the LGBTQ community, and yes, other races. Anyway, not to be dramatic or anything, but the next card reads, "In agony of soul over the degradation and ruin of his people," which I didn't see this movie predicting the overly dramatic emo teenager language for saying I'm upset, but here we are. And here's Ben Cameron standing out looking at the scenery thinking, oh, what can I do with these carpetbaggers and black people? Corrupted people who happen to be black, not to be racist, just ruining my delightful South. Oh, if only I could found an organization to do something about this. But what luck, he sees some kids put on a sheet and scare some black kids, racist stereotype of them spooking easily, and hey, he gets an idea. And in case you're somehow not following the string of thought, the movie spells it out for you with a title card reading, The Result. The Ku Klux Klan, the organization that saved the South from the anarchy of black rule, blah blah, whining about how a non-racist judge was rude enough to talk about the Klan's violence. And if you don't want to see the actual costumed Klan in action, if the iconography of that or, just the general thing is triggering for you or just upsetting, or for whatever reason you don't want to see it, I totally understand that. That's about to start, so I want to let you know. And I'm going to start recording that later. I need a break. This has turned long, so I'm going to come in and in my next session, hopefully finish off this movie. Yay. See you then. So here we are back to get into the parts about the Klan. So let's go, I guess. We get right into it with a scene of three of them in fully developed costumes, initials on the side of a horse and everything, and jump into their first mission. There are a couple just super deliberate looking things about this scene that I anyway think are meant to minimize the Klan's violence. First, they don't actually even do anything to the guy. They just jump out and startle him in their costumes, waving their hands around and stuff, and one does a trick that makes it look like he's drinking a bunch of water. There are actually stories of the Klan using this trick to make themselves look like ghosts, and from what I understand, they were largely rumors meant to play to racist stereotypes of black people as unintelligent and easily frightened. Second, it says the guy was a disturber and barn burner. So they're not trying to subject the entire black population to a reign of constant terror or anything like that. They're just jumping out and saying boo at people who commit crimes with impunity because carpetbaggers and, black judges won't do anything about it. Someone's got to do something, right? And notice the strategy in the language here. Barn burner indicates a clear, dangerous crime committed out of planned malice, but disturber is such a vague accusation it could stick to anybody you wanted it to. So when you stick these two terms together, you get the credibility of addressing real crime with the freedom to apply it to black people in general. And no way that was done on accident. It's absurdly disingenuous, and it's just obviously incongruous with the actual history of the South. The problem is, though, that this movie was the history of the South to too many stupid racists and just generally uninformed people. And speaking of disingenuous, after playing the Klan's actions off as simple pranks against a criminal, it accuses Lynch and his supporters of scoring first blood. So in the clash between the Klan and black people, the real violence came from black people. It would be as weird as if somebody today tried to downplay the violence of white supremacists and blame everything on a vaguely defined Antifa. Uh, could you imagine anything that fucking stupid happening now? Anyway, Antifa, Lynch and his supporters, gunned down these fine people on both sides, innocent KKK heroes, in cold blood. Also, why was the lieutenant governor out in the woods directing bands of vigilante thugs in person? Just kind of weird. So they bring the costumes to Stoneman, presumably, I guess, to tell him about the KKK and everything going on with the KKK. And what does Stoneman say? Anything along the lines of, oh geez, we can't have this band of racists running around terrorizing black people? No. We go right for, we shall crush the white South under the heel of the black South. So no even bare-bones pretense of concern for the equality and safety of black people. Nothing that actual civil rights advocates would actually be concerned about at all. Nope, just clownish bullshit about trying to crush white people. I'm surprised Stoneman didn't just grow a mustache right on the spot so he could twirl it and then tie a white woman to the railroad tracks. Jesus Christ movie. Austin then tells his daughter Elsie that her lover belongs to a murderous band of outlaws, because it's true, and she seems to get mad. Title card even says that she's going to break off the engagement. So they were engaged, I guess. I literally didn't know that. Maybe back then that's what having somebody kiss a bird meant. I don't know. Anyway, she's so mad that she throws a Klan uniform at his feet and storms off in a tizzy, and he's left standing there looking kind of dumbfounded. Just one time you start the world's most infamous racial terror organization, and she flips out and breaks off the entire engagement. Women, right? But one thing she won't do is betray him, and by that she means she won't tell his secret. So, good for her? Seems like the kind of thing you should let people know about. Also, her dad knows, like she literally learned it from him. So isn't the cat out of the bag? Don't make no sense. Now, this might be a good time to point out a pretty chilling observation about this movie, which is how closely it parallels superhero movies. I got this connection from a YouTuber named Anasi's Library who makes a good case for The Birth of a Nation being the first superhero movie and essentially creating the genre. This might sound like a stretch at first glance, the kind of thing that, a revisionist would say just to get attention or whatever, but it's really hard to ignore once you hear it, especially once we get through the rest of the movie. You have a film that's heavily concerned with crime. And not crime as the result of economic conditions that need to be addressed, but crime is something just chosen by somebody who's corrupt and so they want to commit crimes. Because of this, the answer to crime is just to stomp out the person so they don't do it anymore. Criminals commit crimes, so no more criminals, no more crime. But alas, our current institutions are just too ineffectual or just unwilling to hit crime head on. So we need one man, a hero willing to inspire others and strike fear into the hearts of criminals, and both to make himself a symbol and to work outside the law, he dons a stylized cape and hood. Now, I know that given enough data, anybody can sift through things and draw the conclusions they want, and that this can come off as kind of a, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy thing. But it's really hard not to notice how this movie sees the problems and solutions to crime the way that superhero stories do. It even speaks the language of the genre. And this is striking in the scene we just saw, where the love interest discovers and reacts to his secret identity. I wonder if after first being put off by it, she'll come around and see him as a hero. And unlike with the Abraham Lincoln JFK thing, we're not positing a curiosity that's spooky because there's no explanation. There's a clear logical through line here, especially considering how influential Birth of a Nation was on film and modern storytelling. Everybody speaks to the point of exaggeration on how much Birth of a Nation invented modern tropes of film and just entertainment and stuff. So why not own the possibility that racism might have bled into some of that influence? I think people like to be like, oh, well, it's racist, but also it's great filmmaking, and the filmmaking created how we do film and tell stories and stuff like that. But might not some of the racism have gotten in there too? We don't need to take this as a hard conclusion that Birth of a Nation actually invented the superhero. But there are a gradient of meanings here that I think are worth interrogating, especially when thinking about who we are as a society and the assumptions baked into our thinking that might be a little bit racist, regardless how well-intentioned we are, or think we are. Anyway, I would give this video a watch. I didn't watch it until just now, but it was super good and had a huge impact on my thinking. So link in the description if you want to watch it. Anyway, that turned out longer than I thought, but back to the story. Elsie goes back to her room to be sad, and we get a title card saying, over 400,000 costumes were made by women of the South, and not one trust was betrayed. And by betraying trust, they're talking about telling someone that the man in your life is a violent racist vigilante, as if that's not something you should do. And this claim is just dumb, right? And not just brazenly dumb, but theatrically dumb. Not a single woman told anybody that her husband was part of the Klan. I mean, forget fact-checking. Nobody could even know this was true. So when Griffith says this and his audience accepts it, we see that they're willing to, even eager to, communicate and romanticize generalizations that defy basic plausibility, even when taken at face value. I mean, you can say that this claim is meant to be hyperbolic, but even if it were, and I doubt it, I don't think the audience is intended to or going to think that hard about it. It's just going to wash over them as something that's taken as true at face value, even if not in a purely factual sense, just in a general sentimental sense, and they'll just accept it. I mean, can you see this working any other way? And so while this claim itself is relatively unimportant, I think this is just a telling example of how the movie communicates with its audience. Also, the Klan didn't even have uniforms back then, in case we had any question about whether factuality was even a passing concern for this movie or its audience. Back to the story then, you'll never guess what direction the adorable relationship between Ben and his little sister takes. That's right, she helps him make Klan uniforms. Aww. In fact, it's fun for the whole family, and she's just so excited. All ready to help her brother hide his identity when he terrorizes black people. The incongruity between how these two are set up and what they become is just so unsettling. It's disgusting. Elsie doesn't seem to be a fan of the whole thing. Oh, and look, the bird is still alive. What do you know? And the girls are there bagging up Klan uniforms like good, faithful Southern women. Then out of the blue, we get an announcement that little sister is going to the spring all alone, even though her brother had warned her not to.
Foreshadowing is a literary device and...
You know, neighborhood's changing, can't be too careful. But in all seriousness, this is the horrifying incident meant to pull at our heartstrings for all the worst reasons. I'd alluded to it a few minutes ago when the movie was starting to set it up by showing us the renegade fellow Gus hovering over Ben's little sister. And now we get to it. So if you don't want to watch this part, I would suggest skipping ahead to the time mentioned in the description. So she gets up and decides to go, just prancing around all cute and innocent. And there's Gus stalking her significantly less innocently. She just enjoys nature, looking at a squirrel and stuff, while he sits there, leering, waiting. Just incredibly ugly image of what they are hovering, waiting to do to your women. Back home, Mom's worrying. Ben hears that she went off and is just horrified, of course. And this sets off the climactic chase. Gus calls himself a captain and says he wants to marry her. Probably the movie's way of showing us how devious they are and what giving them authority makes them feel entitled to. She resists and runs, and he gives chase. Extended sequence with him chasing her and Ben just behind. Oh, can he get there in time to save her? And again, this is the worst of this movie's deviousness. Given the setup, I really feel for this young woman. I want her to get away, and honestly, I vicariously fear Gus on her behalf. I also feel the tension of hoping Ben can get to his sister before Gus does. That's the power of cinema. It conjures these feelings in you, and it's hard not to feel them when taking the scene at face value, which we instinctively do when we're watching movies. But the problem is, like I'd said during the scene of the Camerons learning about their son's death, that this movie is hijacking your empathy, trying to get you to take your feelings about this scene specifically as fear and disgust toward black people in general. I feel honestly gross having the temptation to feel anything about this scene considering what I know it's trying to do. And as much as I hate it and want to just say it's trash, it's just total garbage and I could never see how it would ever affect anybody at any time, I honestly can see how it would be impactful, especially on people operating at a certain latent level of ignorance and racism. And I don't like saying that. As a white person, it would be very easy for me to say, like, this is just absolutely disgusting. I don't see any possible power here. You know, it doesn't get anything in me. But I think we need to air this out a little bit and let this tell us what it says about us as people. It doesn't mean that I like the conclusions. It doesn't mean I like the racial undertones, but I do see the power of what it's doing. I do see how this works as a piece of dramatic cinema, how it pulls at certain biases in you, and you kind of have to check yourself a little bit when watching it. If we don't acknowledge this, then we're just turning our heads from certain instincts we have and ways that they apply to a white population that has had a lot of power over a black population. And when we do that, I think we're turning our heads aside and letting the victims of racism just deal with this in silence. And I don't think that's a good thing for us to do. It's comforting. It's easy for us. It lets us tell ourselves we're good people. But I think we have a responsibility to think a little harder about this. We need to trouble ourselves to feel why this works and to let us be bothered by the fact that on some level, dramatically, this works on us. Big brother finds the bucket, then Gus's jacket. Little sister keeps running, Gus keeps pursuing. She gets chased up a cliff and tells him to stay back or she'll jump. He doesn't stay back, and finally she throws herself off before he can accost her. Sadly, Big Brother is just a little too far behind and gets there just in time to see she'd fall into her death. This is the climactic tragedy of the movie, and by any objective measure, it's very effective. The way the Big Brother-little sister dynamic sets it up, the way the chase builds tension and leads to a tragedy of bad timing. It's well constructed and cinematically feels very modern, at least to me, not being an expert in film history. But of course, it's not about tragedy, it's about outrage. This is Ben Cameron's Bruce Wayne seeing his parents killed scene. It makes his broader concerns about the South feel more personal and more powerful and whips the audience into the intended frenzy. This is probably what led to so many lynchings wherever this movie was shown. It was cinematically effective at making a really shitty point. And I think the choice to have her leap to her death was very deliberate, very carefully planned out, almost necessary. Because this movie was kind of walking a tightrope here. On one hand, it wanted to squeeze as much outrage as possible out of seeing a white woman victimized by a black man. But I'm guessing on the other hand, even an implied depiction of him assaulting her was so odious to the racist audience that the movie couldn't even go there. I mean, think of how disgusted these shitheads are because the existence of mixed-race people even abstractly implies interracial relations at any undefined point in the past. So imagine how they'd react to a story where a specific black man gets his hands on a specific white woman in the narrative present, even off screen. I think their racist minds would short-circuit, for all the wrong reasons, of course, those reasons being racist. So the cliff-jumping scene lets the threat of interracial assault hang over the audience's heads, while in the end freeing them from that possibility while still giving them an outrageous conclusion. It's a pretty horrific glimpse into the ugly minds of bigots, especially when you consider that the interracial part, more than, if not at least as much as the assault part, was really what was digging at them here. You can probably guess the impact this scene has on the movie moving forward, right? Ben runs up to his sister and finds her still alive. She talks to him, presumably explaining what had happened, and his face cycles through understandable though racistly contrived grief and horror. Then she dies in his arms and his grief turns into rage. You know, evil racist Batman is going to avenge her death by going after Gus and black people in general. But not the bad ones, I'm sure, not to be racist. It comforts the audience by essentially saying she'd gone to heaven and says she'd learned a stern lesson in honor, which I don't really like. It seems like honor in this case means keeping yourself away from a black man, even if you have to throw yourself to your death to do it. And no, I'm not making light of her trying to escape an assault. But we all know very damn well that the honor this movie is talking about is mostly about Gus's race. Or at the very least, it conflates that with the danger she was in. Also, even if we totally remove anything racial from this scene, talking about her having an obligation to maintain some form of honor just it really is gross. Don't put that on a woman who's in this situation. This is about trauma. This is about danger you're in and how it's going to impact you. You have no obligation to uphold some form of honor and to do whatever is necessary to escape that. It feels like victim blaming. It feels like if you fail in that attempt to uphold honor that you've done something wrong or let something bad happen. So just fuck you, movie, even when talking about women as much as black people. Just ugh. Ben brings back her body, and of course Mother is horrified, and so is Big Sister and Father. Then a title card reading, and none grieved more than these. Any idea who this is referring to? You guessed it, probably, a couple of their faithful slaves. So this movie just keeps throwing down the "we're not racist, we have black friends" card, while implying slaves are in a close family relationship with their owners. If you've seen it once, you've seen it 1,000 times. And I feel like I've literally seen it 1,000 times in this movie. Then the son's plea against his father's radical policy. I'm sure the father in question will be Austin Stoneman and the radical policy will be not being racist, but let's see. So they don't give title cards providing the dialogue, but it's obvious Phil Stoneman here is like, hey dad, let's not be all crazy breaking up these families of faithful servants and their kindly owners. And Austin makes a hard Mussolini face and probably replies something about hating white people and putting the whites under the heel of the blacks. You know, like progressive people do. There's a brief scene over the body of dead pet sister just to remind us how sad this is, which it is, but let's remember how we're being manipulated. And Ben pulls his hidden racist Batman uniform out from under the body because the movie is just determined to keep sentimentality about him and his sister tied to Confederacy and racism art synonyms fun. And isn't it just so obvious what a superhero movie this is? He is totally the vigilante hero hiding his costume and secret identity. I honestly feel a little embarrassed for not having seen it more clearly before. Anyway, speaking of how we're being manipulated, the very next scene shows us guilty Gus finding a black hangout to go hide in. And of course, all his black friends are totally willing to hide him because that's just what they're like, I guess. No question they showed us the scene of the family grieving right before this, just to remind us how outraged we should feel about Gus as he's trying to hide and, all these other black people are trying to help him. So Ben approaches a bunch of the old boys in town and we hear that they're being enlisted to search for Gus. But it's so that he can be given a fair trial, so that's good. But wait, this trial is going to happen in the dim halls of the Invisible Empire. Oof. So for anybody who's slow on the draw, they're planning a lynching. And of course, in their minds, a lynching amounts to a fair trial. And this is no incidental detail. The entire movie has been building toward this conclusion. Everything has been about how Northern interference is blocking the proper flow of law and order, only most obviously telegraphed in the scene of a black jury collaborating with a black witness. So not only can the Klan administer proper law and order, it's the only tool available to do so. As surely as Batman, it's filling a void left by a gutted legal system. Except with the courts just as broken as law enforcement, the Klan has to serve both as the police who investigate the crime and as the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. So maybe we're seeing the roots of propaganda here? I don't know. Maybe I'm just pattern seeking, but still, seems like there's a bit of a thread. So the good old country boys, of course, are all like, we're going to go help you find this guy. And sure enough, one walks up to the gin mill where Gus is hiding. His friends are trying to cover for him, but the white boy seems suspicious and asks around. This causes things to get a little tense, and soon enough punches are being thrown. Turns into just a big old brawl, with our white boy, of course, holding off the lot of them. He even picks one up above his heads and throws him at the rest. Totally wacky pro wrestling hijinks. Then Gus runs out and joins the fight, so we know full well what's going on now. Our hero keeps fighting them off because of all his superior talent and tosses Gus into the street. But suddenly one of the guys pulls out a gun and shoots him. And let's just pause to acknowledge here just how determined this movie is to not give anything to black people. Not only are the people hanging around this mill, shifty and devious ne'er-do-wells trying to hide an offender, trying to save him from justice, but in a fight, one white old boy can just beat them all up, and the only way they can get one up on him is to sneakily shoot him in the back. It's juvenile. Gus shoots him again. This movie is really obvious about firing its guns off to the side. Maybe they didn't have blanks, I don't know. Then he gets on a horse and tries to escape, but someone shoots him off his horse and Ben and his fellas grab him. This is going to get totally dark here because what's next is what this movie calls the trial. And by that I mean a ceremonial lynching where all the lynchers are uniformed Klan members. There's a flashback to the Camerons' grieving pet sister just to remind us of all our sympathies and outrage. Then Ben takes off his mask and reveals himself to Gus all racist Bruce Wayne-like. The word guilty appears on screen and they drag Gus away. So, I'm no expert, I only specialize in bird law, but this doesn't seem like due process to me. But maybe that's the entire point. This movie establishes that due process isn't working properly anymore, then shows us a horrible contrived outrage that will make the audience demand justice with or without due process. Wouldn't it be wild if even today there were a whole body of rhetoric meant to justify sending in masked men to respond to a manufactured racially aligned crisis without due process? In case it's been too long since I've said it, wow, how things just always stay the same. Then, like any organization that's a court, not a racial terrorist organization, they throw Gus's body on the steps of the lieutenant governor, who, in case you forgot, is Silas Lynch. And notice how not shy this movie is about pivoting straight from not to be racist, we have black friends to this is our answer to the blacks. Really pushing the limits of plausible deniability there, movie. We see the family grieve a little more, gotta remind us why the Klan does what it does. And Lynch sees Gus's body and accepts the challenge by ordering black militias to fill the streets. Now, Lynch's move here just makes perfect sense and is the right thing to do, right? At least just taken factually on an objective level when you think about what steps he took. Vigilantes who have been going around terrorizing people have literally left a body at your door as a calling card. I don't see a strong law enforcement response being uncalled for. But, of course, look at how this movie casts it. First, it racializes who Lynch is mobilizing and says he's filling the streets with black people. So it turns this act into the very problem this movie is concerned with: those people running free and filling the streets. And second, it makes Gus's guilt a foregone conclusion by showing us, the audience, things people in the real world might not be aware of, and keeps blasting us in the face with reminders of the grief he caused. This not only makes it a knee-jerk reaction for the audience to see Gus's fate as a good thing just automatically, but it creates this muddy insinuation that Silas is uninterested in or even party to what Gus did. You know, that's what those people are there for anyway, at least when they step outside their God-ordained role as the faithful. So the audience sees them all committing these crimes as a body and trying to get each other off the hook. And I think the point here is pretty obvious. D.W. Griffith and racists like him know that law enforcement reactions to their racial terror are the only lifeline that their victims have. And they know that most people, most decent people anyway, will see this as a good thing. So their rhetoric is designed to make it all look ugly. It's obvious and disgusting. Stoneman decides things are getting too hot for him, so to avoid the consequences of the unrest he created, he runs out of town. Because he's just a coward, of course. This is basically like any scene where a black person or a scallywag picks on someone, and as soon as, any danger comes or there's any real pushback, they make this scared look and run off kind of comically. It's pretty gross. Then we get a really disturbing Klan ritual, which of course this movie will glorify. He brings out a burning cross, which was not used by the original Klan, and in fact I understand it to have been inspired by this movie, so we just keep playing really free and loose with history, and it says he quenches its flames in the sweetest blood that ever stained the sands of time. Which I really hope does not mean he drained blood from his sister's corpse for this ceremony, but that's kind of what it sounds like. Regardless, this romanticization of Klan ceremony is just horrifying. Also, Ben Cameron's costume makes it look like he has giant boobs. Dumb loser. And I guess this was all a really elaborate way of sending a guy out to tell the Klan to disarm black people. Meanwhile, Silas Lynch is sending spies to catch people with KKK uniforms. And notice the loaded language here. The Klan is dispassionately described as just trying to disarm blacks, while the other side is looking to hunt out whites and put them to death? This is brazen fear-mongering, especially considering there was no death penalty just for being in the Klan. As we've seen 1,000 times, this is just racists throwing themselves on the floor and crying that other people are doing to them what they do to others. It muddies what should be a very straightforward condemnation of their racial terror by just kind of frivolously flinging accusations in all directions. So, I guess MAGA didn't invent that strategy. Or it invented it back when it was still called the Klan. Anyway, Margaret is still hiding Ben's Klan costume when a black-faced Union officer sneakily spies on her. Not sure if that's how spying works, but okay. Sure hope she doesn't get caught and executed for hiding that uniform, says the movie's intended audience. Lynch is just obviously wasted, so I guess showing someone drunk isn't a hang-up for this movie, and he wants revenge on the Camerons. Not justice or equality or protection for former slaves, revenge. You should be getting the idea by now. Scalawag officer and his black-faced men come to arrest them and find the uniform. Pa Cameron isn't having that, and they rough him up and drag him out into the street. And Silas is just oh so happy to see what's happening. Margaret goes and asks Elsie Stoneman to get involved, maybe get her family off the hook for the pretended consequences of their racism. And the faithful get involved because, not to be racist, we have black friends. So when the master is paraded in front of his slaves in chains, all passion play-like, they pretend to join those naughty people who don't like being slaves. So very, very naughty. They rough up their old master. Oh, the indignity. I'm sure slaves were never treated so poorly. But the faithful fight them off. Phil Stoneman joins the rescue, and they rush Pa Cameron off in a cart. This, of course, turns into a big chase, so hopefully we'll have enough action to chip away at some runtime without a lot of commentary. There goes the cart, and there goes the Union soldiers like Keystone Cops. Then Social Lion of the New Aristocracy, which I guess is Lynch and his friends having a party, again making the point that this isn't about basic rights and equality. This movie doesn't even seem to acknowledge that framework. It's just a battle to claw your way to the top, so when black people go for more than being slaves, they're just trying to usurp what white people have. Nothing complex or surprising here. And speaking of not surprising, we get Elsie Stoneman sitting all nervously and Silas staring off like he's having ideas. Back to the chase, long story short, the wagon breaks and they end up having to hide in the cabin of two Union veterans. Uh-oh, Union veterans. But this title card quickly breaks any potential tension by saying that they're united in common defense of their Aryan birthright. Wow, okay. So if we had any doubts that the softening of Abraham Lincoln was this movie's way of extending an olive branch to racists up north, I think this just makes that really clear, right? You see what they're going for here. And also, they're just really dialing back the thin pretense at not to be racist rhetoric. Don't want your racist audience to think you're actually not racist. So they all settle into the cabin together while Union soldiers who are not so invested in this whole Aryan birthright thing, black, close in outside. But while we're still waiting for this inevitable siege, we're introduced to a second climactic storyline that I think you probably saw coming, as Elsie goes in to get help from Lynch, ignorant of his designs on her. So he's going after her, surprise, surprise. She walks in past menacing black soldiers and he greets her with just the creepiest possible grin, tells everybody to leave and closes the doors and everything, then proposes marriage to her. Much like Gus did to Pet's sister. You seeing a stereotype develop? She says no, he gets pushy, and she apparently threatens to have him whipped for his insolence. So always count on this movie to respond racistly to sexual harassment. His response is to show all the black Union soldiers outside and say, "My people fill the streets, you can be my queen," and so on. Just all the racist fear-mongering at one time. This is where, with all our racist protagonists under threat from racistly caricatured black people, the Klan comes in for its big rescue. They run around gathering while Lynch menaces Elsie and threatens a forced marriage on her. Lots of cutting back and forth between scenes to build tension. I guess this cutting back and forth for tension is one of the things people say this movie invented, even though it didn't. But then, oopsie, Austin Stoneman comes back. Looks like soldiers won't even let him in the door at first, but when he finally gets in, Lynch says he wants to marry a white woman, and Austin's reaction? Just shakes his hand and is all like, "Well, good for you, bro." More Klan writing, quick cut back to the cabin, and then Lynch reveals, "It's your daughter I want to marry." And Stoneman doesn't seem to think much of that at all. So it looks like he has a real not-in-my-backyard attitude about interracial marriage, and all his ideas about equality are just empty hypocrisy. Wow, what a twist, movie. Did not see that coming. Ooh, next we see the town is given over to... not gonna say that, but you get the idea. Stoneman sowed the wind, and now the town is just covered in urban blight. And just look at all that urban blight. See, racist, what you have to look forward to if you allow for any equality? Alright, Elsie gets forced into a chair when she tries to break a window and call for help, and Lynch forces Stoneman into a chair when he objects to the whole thing. See what happens when you try to be nice to them? They turn on you and, of course, try to marry your white daughter. Jesus Christ. So back at the cabin, soldiers are closing in. Pa Cameron is about to give himself up. Union veterans aren't having it, so it looks like we're headed for a shootout. Now, all this time, we keep cutting to large swarms of Klan riding in, so it looks like both of these storylines hinge on whether they'll get there on time. Kind of like a stupid racist version of Gandalf rushing into Helm's Deep. All the while, those black mobs are just really getting out of hand while white people look helplessly on, in case we haven't driven the point home hard enough yet. At this point, I'm kind of happy to say, I don't even have the slightest deep-down knee-jerk instinctive hope for the protagonist to come out okay. Seeing Klan members riding to the rescue really breaks the spell, and the movie is just too craven in how it depicts black people the moment you give them freedom. Same exact fear they stoke at the idea of those people being turned loose in your society today. As you'd expect, the Klan shows up in both locations, starts shooting black people in the streets, and breaks the siege of the cabin. They drive the urban blight just right out of town. But wait, a white woman, Elsie Stoneman, is still in peril at the hands of a black man, but they get there just in time. Ben even takes a minute to flash his face at Elsie in a Batman impressing his love interest scene. She, of course, is happy about it now, a reversal I can only attribute to her generalizing what Silas did to her onto all black people. I'm sure that step goes without saying to the audience of this movie, but it's pretty wild when you actually stop and think about it. So like I'd said before, this climax is modeled beat by beat after the initial Union guerrilla scene from Part 1. Scalawags sent agitators into town, and with no choice because of how the government got involved, the whites band together to effect their own rescue. Once in the form of Confederate soldiers, the other time in the form of Klansmen. Each sequence has parallel scenes of big-picture action in the streets and women in peril indoors. And of course, it can't be lost on us that it's Ben's love interest in danger of forceful marriage to a black man. Just a big old part of what drives the race-baiting tension in this scene. Imagine a black man was coming for your woman. The closer you look at all this movie's deliberate little dramatic choices, the more obviously disgusting it is. Like, usually your brain notices this stuff before you do, as Mr. Plinkett says. But maybe that only works with this movie's intended audience. And maybe that's why I thought more when I first watched this just kind of casually that this movie was more of a slow burn racistly than it ended up being. A lot of this stuff is in details that maybe just passed over me or I didn't pay enough attention to, or maybe I was just oblivious. Then the Klan hears about the cabin under siege, so off to resolve that dramatic contrivance. Just look at all that black peril trying to get into the cabin. Just deliberately trying to evoke feelings of the danger of them trying to get into your house. Oh, but the faithful slave is fighting them off too, so it's not about race. They're pushed back into the back room, looks like all is about lost. Soldiers who happen to be black just crawling in from all directions, a little girl crying. But huzzah, the Klan gets there just in time. Who would have ever thought? They fight them off, the black soldiers go running like cowards the way this movie always shows them doing. Then the Klan takes a weird little moment to strike a pose for the camera and runs inside. And everybody's okay. Yay. A scene called Disarming the Blacks, not to be racist, and action. They all run away. But, hang on. No black people are allowed to have guns? That's weird. Because didn't this movie have black friends and only care about the trouble stirred up by radical Northerners? Oh wait, maybe that was just insincere bullshit. Interesting parallel too to modern times where conservatives tend to be Second Amendment absolutists while also stirring up the fear of a black person having anything that looks like a gun. Everybody cheers for the Klan cleaning up that urban blight, just like they'd earlier cheered their boys in gray, and all the whites who had been in fear in their own homes need fear no more. Oh, but we're not even done yet. Black people show up to vote, but the Proud Boys are there monitoring election security. Do you see how so much of modern conservatism is just post-Civil War race baiting continued straight from the beginning of the 20th century through today? Our happy ending is just the two couples on their honeymoons, which taken literally is a pretty expected he gets the girl and we're off into the sunset Hollywood conclusion. But I see more happening here, which of course given this movie's stupid and racist message. At its core, the thing I think it's appealing to is not hatred of black people as much as a comfortable life that the audience feels entitled to. When you feel like that's automatically owed to you, then it's by extension that you also think that you're owed for other races or classes of people to support it through their labor, and also to, not dirty the streets with their presence after you've curated that environment for yourself. I think that's why this movie is okay with racist friends as long as they're the faithful who just know their place within the system and, don't disrupt the boundaries you've set for them. And I think that's also why the happy conclusion of this movie is a couple white people living in comfort. They've put those people in their place. Their happy lifestyle that they have has been reinstated, and now they're living the dream again. And that's just really kind of ugly and gross, right? There's just an utter lack of concern for anybody who's different than you. As long as you get what you think is coming to you, you set the world in order to make that happen. As long as you can curate that little bubble that you live in comfortably and happily, whatever happens to other people is either not consequential or is just a necessary part of making that happen. And maybe that's something we all have to confront. I think we all live happy lives largely because of the misery and labor of other people. And maybe we should think about that a little bit more. But it tells me something that this movie's conclusion seems to be just looking that directly in the face and saying, that's a good thing. Get those blacks off the street, put them back in the fields. We want to live like this, and whatever they go through for that is beside the fact. And they probably do have some aesthetic attachment to the idea of direct racism and stuff and of putting black people in their place. I'm not saying that doesn't exist at all. But I think what this movie ends with kind of tells us something. So what about the birth of a nation in general? What more is there for me to say? I guess this is where I would typically make a big, long concluding speech tying all my thoughts together. But I feel like I've done enough of that over the course of this. This movie obviously was just incredibly gross and disgusting. Just on a personal level, I hated what it said about black people. And especially about mixed race people, just because what it said about them just invalidated them as people. They weren't even a class of people that need to be put in a certain level of labor and stuff like that. They were just these weird, vile abominations. And the weird fixation I had on them just didn't sit right with me. Again, I'm just reiterating, but just how modern this is just really disturbing to me. You really, as an American and as a white person, even if I'm leftist and consider myself progressive and don't want to think I have these instincts, you do want to feel like your culture and what you've grown up in and your deep down mindsets, those are all kind of okay and maybe pure and valid. So it was kind of disturbing when this movie showed me that a lot of this thinking just runs straight through a current of American thought It's something I think I already kind of knew, but looking at it as hard as I did in this movie is just really gross. I just see so much commonality there. To conservatism, of course, this movie is just almost a one-to-one analog to modern conservatism. It's really striking when you watch it. But also it just pokes at a lot of the little things in the back of my mind that you're always maybe kind of working at uprooting, trying to make yourself a better person and trying to challenge those little assumptions that get in your head. And seeing some of those in this movie, some of those first gut instincts that you're always checking in yourself, but they're kind of there. This is like holding a mirror up to us and seeing how ugly and just how gross and bigoted a lot of our culture is. And this is just a more direct reflection of that. But we've just put this little tiny coat of paint over it. And I don't know, watching Birth of a Nation kind of peels that coat of paint back and makes you look at it for what it is. Anyway, those are my thoughts. This was a very disturbing movie for many, many reasons. I would suggest not really watching it unless you just want to confront it more directly than you did by watching this video. I hope this project was valuable. It was very time consuming, took a lot of mental effort on my part. I really didn't like sitting with this movie as long as I did. And I hope to move on to other things. I hope this was valuable. I hope I wasn't co-opting something as a white person in discourse surrounding this movie or talking in clumsy ways. I could see myself having gone in places that maybe I shouldn't have or overstepping, but hopefully people find value in it. Anyway, have a good day, everybody.